Time has no meaning in this place. Every day is the same. Wake up, watch a few Simpsons, go to sleep. Wake up, watch a few Simpsons, go to sleep. We have Christmases, Halloweens, Easters, and everything in between, but every day is the same. Homer has a stupid new job or hobby. Bart is having trouble at school. Lisa is being picked on. The seasons change and no one grows old. I fear I'm going to die here.
So, when I started this project where I watched the entirety of The Simpsons and do some analysis videos about how it's changed over the years, I envisioned it as 3 videos. One on the early years in the Golden Age, one post-Golden Age and the movie, and one on what I loosely referred to in this rough outline as modern Simpsons. And it's taken me all the way up until now to realise that what I referred to there as modern Simpsons encompasses almost half of it. My first video on seasons 1 to 9 covers 203 episodes. The second covers 197 plus the movie. That leaves over 350 episodes and a bunch of shorts depending on when you're watching this. It is insane to me just how much Simpsons has been made since the movie came out. People have been saying The Simpsons has been going forever and there's too much of it since even before the movie, and it's shocking when you realise that that was almost half the show ago. And yet if you ask a randomer who's not a mega fan to name you 10 episodes post-movie that aren't Eternal Moonshine of the Simpson Mind or Holidays of Future Past, they'll probably stare at you blankly and go, the Lady Gaga one? Oh, can I have Treehouse of Horror 20 through 30? No. And that's why when you look at those numbers, you paradoxically think there must be a lot to talk about in there, at the same time as thinking there can't be much to talk about in there. Because that is a lot of episodes, but if barely anyone remembers most of it, there must be a reason. I have found a lot to talk about, as you can probably tell from that runtime, but by and large, most of the criticisms of the show itself and the holes in general opinions of it post-Golden Age that I talked about in the last one of these do still stand. There are some shit episodes that suffer from the same issues, good ones that people don't recognise when they see them, and I noticed something interesting that started happening not long after the movie, and I know any fanbase gets irritable when you start out by criticising them, and my apologies if this opening section annoys you, but I have to start with it, and rather than do much of a lead-in, I'm just going to be blunt. The Simpsons writers are not idiots, and they can see you. As the internet became more widespread, it fully cemented the idea The Simpsons has been running for too long and it's not good anymore as the mainstream Simpsons opinion, because the more it gets said, the more it gets repeated. Regardless of whether people still keep up with it and have the basis to form their own opinions, they feel comfortable with agreeing with it. People don't really think too deeply about blanket statements like the characters have changed, Homer is no longer sincere and he's a jerk now, they're recycling themselves, the formulas are stale, the obvious rivals are influencing it and dragging it off course. I'm not saying any of this is wrong, there is some truth to all of these assertions. As I explored in my analysis of the post-Golden Age, there comes a point where Homer stops feeling like a real person and becomes just a tool for chaos. And your lead character ceasing to be a character is a fragile state of affairs for any show. Not just because The Simpsons relied on a certain level of emotional sincerity to retain the warmth of its audience, but also because it's The Simpsons. A giant of pop culture like this that almost everyone who's ever watched a piece of television at all has at least one fond memory of, the idea that these are no longer the characters they once knew and loved and are just stock characters running through endless permutations of the same handful of formulas is going to be damaging to it long term. And I feel I need to underline here, and I have been guilty myself of missing this for the record, when people have made these points about the decline of the show, they seem to talk as if the writers of the show will not be fully aware of what's happened to it. The writers are smart people, they'd have to be to make it in this industry at all, and especially so to make it onto the staff of a show with this kind of legacy. They all have an internet connection, everybody does. They're all aware of public perceptions about the show, it's their job to know what the audience thinks. And all writing is essentially problem solving. How do we get a character from point A where the story starts to point B where the story finishes? That's a problem that the writer solves. The show has made it very obvious how plugged in they are to fan discourse in recent years, like with this season 33 episode Poorhouse Rock, where they engage with this specific article that outlines how a low middle class American family living in a 4-bedroom house with a single income doesn't work in the modern day. The writers will definitely have looked at the structural weaknesses of the show that became more apparent the longer it went on. They'll be aware of the criticisms of post-Golden Age Homer and will have noticed that that opinion has formed specifically because it becomes obvious he's a jerk and he never learns his lessons and never changes, because otherwise the show would end. They'll have taken all this on board and gone, okay, how do we solve this problem? Because when you actually watch post-movie Simpsons, not just taking the modern Simpsons sucks, it has changed and it's not like it used to be, opinion is read, attempts to not so much resolve this issue with the characters, but use the fact audience perception of The Simpsons has changed to tell new kinds of stories, are stupefyingly easy to spot. Eternal Moonshine of the Simpson Mind from season 19 has gone on to be one of the most fondly remembered post-movie episodes. Eternal Moonshine is a very smart episode because it's entirely about the idea that the viewer no longer trusts Homer to not behave like a monster. It opens on him waking up after a drinking bender where he's lost his memory. Marge and the kids have vanished, and he has this vague, hazy memory that seems to imply that Marge was cheating on him, and as a result, he punched her. But he could never do that, right?
Marge had a black eye? I could never do something like that. Could I?
No, of course not. Homer's not a physically abusive monster, is he? That's way too far, even for Oh, wait a minute.
Boy must die!
I love you, Dad!
Eternal Moonshine is about the common fan criticism that latter-day Homer is an abusive monster, when he actually always was, and everyone just gave him a free pass. But that free pass becomes harder to give him the more you watch. And Eternal Moonshine uses that disconnect to tell a highly compelling story of doubt. Homer doubts his own memories and whether he's really like this, but he does consider the possibility that he might be. This episode is the writers channeling complaints about modern Homer into the character metatextually wrestling with himself and trying to figure out what he's truly capable of, and it is utterly fascinating. It's far removed from Golden Age Simpsons, but Homer having this capacity for reflection on his behaviour in this way that takes account of the fact that the audience doesn't trust him anymore is truly compelling. He framed Marge for drunk driving, he's abusive and spiteful towards his father. So deep down, some little part of you thinks that it might be possible that Homer actually did punch Marge after he found out she was cheating on him. Obviously that's not what the resolution's going to be, but a part of you has to kind of believe it in the moment. This is extreme behaviour done right. As I mentioned in the last one of these, the show started showcasing more extreme behaviour, but there was nowhere near enough reflection or nuance, and it gets more over the top as the ideas started running dry, and Homer stopped even feeling like the vague facsimile of a real person that a cartoon protagonist is supposed to be. The Homer that we see in Eternal Moonshine feels like a real person again, because his apparent extreme behaviour comes with some form of doubt. And that doubt is only possible now because a part of the viewer believes that Homer might be capable of it. Because think here, would this episode have worked nearly as well if it was done during the Golden Age? Because we always used to look the other way with this obvious abuse of Bart and buy Homer's bullshit whenever he's done something wrong and he's gone, "But I love you though." "But I love you though" doesn't work anymore. During the Golden Age, you wouldn't even dream of there being any way that the resolution of this story would be, yes, he did do it. And of course, you do know that he didn't. There's that little doubt in your mind now because of your current perception of Homer. It's very similar to another personal favourite, also from season 19, Dial N for Nerder, where it looks like Bart and Lisa are responsible for Martin falling off a cliff and apparently dying. When this happens, Bart's immediate instinct is to run away and try and suppress his feelings.
I can bike away much faster and ring the bell to drown out bad thoughts.
But then when they get home, he says this.
I've been in trouble, but never like this. Guess I'll go turn myself in.
But then it's Lisa who tries to get away with it.
Martin's gone, but it was an accident. Ruining our lives won't bring him back.
Lisa's always been focused on being perfect. While yes, she's the moral backbone of the show, putting her in such an extreme situation that mars her record of perfect behaviour and watching how she squares it could only be believable now that we've seen her succumb to her darker impulses, like that time she got a restraining order against Bart. Lisa actually becomes more well-rounded this way by using her desperation to have a spotless record in an extreme scenario. This isn't changing her core character, it's using the fact the viewers have had their doubts about the character's sincerity now to test what they would do in this utterly deranged scenario. And to me at least, this kinda rings true. It's nothing like the Golden Age at all, but my point is this style of storytelling builds on public perception of the show, so it's still functional in spite of the structural flaws that have become more pronounced the longer The Simpsons has gone on. There are other episodes that directly address fan complaints. For example, did any of you know that they started undoing flanderization? As stated in the last one of these, I have my issues with flanderization as an argument, defining the changes made to Ned Flanders as being inarguably bad and having no possible reason to be made either in-universe or out-of-universe. But if it's understood on a very basic level that Flanders used to be the perfect neighbour, now he's an annoying fundamentalist Christian, alright, fair enough, that's what you mean when you say the word flanderization in reference to The Simpsons. But they actually start ditching the parody of Flanders as a fundamentalist Christian and return to the good neighbour dynamic fairly soon after the show goes HD. In this season 20 episode, No Loan Again Naturally, the Simpsons lose their home and Ned buys their house out of pity and becomes their landlord. And he tries to be a good landlord, but Homer takes advantage of him and pushes him to breaking point. I don't think this episode works because I went into it with my then current understanding of fundamentalist Christian Ned, and I still couldn't see him as anything other than a Westboro Baptist Church stand-in by this point, and the attempt to double back on about a decade's worth of shift in focus with his character felt inauthentic to me. But this episode is quite obviously the show listening to a criticism and saying, we get it, and trying to shift the show away from making broader points about Christian fundamentalism by way of Ned and back towards the simple good neighbour bad neighbour dynamic. They don't even strike a balance and do both. From this point on, there's one or two jokes here and there, but for the most part, haha, look at how awful fundamentalist Christians are by way of Ned Flanders kinda stops being a thing at all. I don't understand why I seem to be the only person who's noticed that flanderization stopped entirely in 2009. This trope has been basically dead in this show for about 15 years. This is what everybody wanted, right? Similarly, my problem that I mentioned last time with the kidney episode, where in this rewritten understanding of the Homer-Abe relationship, where Abe's abuse of Homer has been removed and now Abe was a good father to Homer and Homer thinks he's a jerk seemingly for no reason at all, gets addressed in this episode in season 24 to Cur with Love, where we find out that Homer had a dog when he was a kid. It bit Mr. Burns and Grandpa has to give it away, and Homer doesn't understand why because obviously he's a kid. And he grows up with warped memories of this incident that made him hate his father that are missing the understanding of the real world that a kid wouldn't have.
I happen to remember it just a little differently. Grandpa always hated Bongo and loved money, so he sold Bongo to a wicked farm witch and kidnapped Santa so I'd never get the toy I actually wanted.
And obviously Homer wouldn't have dealt with this in therapy in the intervening years because he thinks this about therapy.
It breaks up families. It turns wives against husbands, children against fathers, neighbors against me.
So yeah, that huge issue I had with the Abe-Homer relationship over the post-Golden Age period is completely fixed in this episode. And following this episode, that means they have to come up with interesting reasons for Homer and Abe to have fallings out again, like in this season 29 episode, Forgive and Regret. It looks like Abe's about to die and he whispers a deathbed confession to Homer that when his mother left home, he destroyed a box of recipes that she left him because he didn't want anything in the house that reminded him of her, and he lied to Homer and said that she took them with her when she left. Homer's rightly incensed by this, and so we've got a legitimate reason for conflict. I think the show deserves much more respect for doing things like this. There is really quite obvious evidence of it actually looking at criticisms of the show and taking some initiative to try and solve the audience's problems with it and create interesting stories as a result. But obviously it won't get any credit for this, because by this point everyone had the same opinion of The Simpsons, it has changed, it's not like it used to be and therefore is bad, and had largely lost faith in it. Of course, another reason for this could potentially be down to the factor of never-ending reruns. The Simpsons hasn't really existed as a continuous linear show to quite a lot of people for some time now. When I was a kid, BBC Two aired seasons 9 and 10 on a loop, while Sky One aired the up-to-date ones. Then it moved to Channel 4 and they basically just started airing random episodes as schedule filler because if people are flicking through channels and land on The Simpsons, they probably won't turn it off. So if it's 2015 and you see that Channel 4 is airing the 2006 episode The Monkey Suit, you'll think to yourself, oh yeah, The Simpsons must still be doing Flanders is a religious nutjob jokes, even though they literally hadn't for over half a decade by that point. And the show as it currently stood at the time was attempting to make some genuine changes to try and restore some of the goodwill that it had lost. Personally, I really enjoyed seasons 19 through 22 in particular during this watch through. There's the odd bad episode here and there, one of which really bugged me that I'll get to in a bit, but I felt like the show suddenly had some energy and life to it again after a so-so run of 16, 17 and 18. However, something really odd started happening in seasons 21 and 22 that I need to discuss. Now, this section of the video might be unique to me, but I need to cover this because it's a key point that underpins the entire period of post-movie Simpsons. I knew I'd stopped watching The Simpsons at season 16, but I had seen all of season 27 on a random occasion in 2015 when I remembered it was still going, and I decided to watch a full current season of it and then try some episodes from the seasons I skipped out on that sounded interesting, like Eternal Moonshine and Dial N for Nerder. So I assumed that out of this massive chunk of Simpsons between season 17 and the present day, I'd seen a handful of episodes, all of season 27, and that was that. But then something weird happened in the season 21 episode, Bart Gets a Z. It's a pretty decent episode if you never saw it. One of Bart's pranks gets Mrs. Grubapple fired, and he feels bad, and helps her to get her life back on track. I really enjoyed this one. I identified with Edna's struggles to find something positive in her otherwise bleak life with a class full of kids who seem to go out of their way to crush her dreams of being a great teacher. And it's got one of the finest single lines of dialogue in a Simpsons episode that I'd heard in years.
Okay, Edna, remember, if you can teach one kid one thing, then today will be a success.
Then, when she gets fired, Bart helps her open a muffin store, and it looks for a minute like this might be the new status quo. Edna is no longer a teacher, and she now owns a muffin store. And at that point I thought, wait. I know what's about to happen. Bart's going to admit what he did that got her fired, because it looks like everything worked out for the best, so it doesn't really matter that he screwed her over without her knowing. Then Edna's going to turn around and yell at him that she hates this store and that all she ever wanted was to be a teacher. And that's exactly what happened.
I'm the one who put booze in your coffee and got you fired.
You did what? It's your fault I have to work at this stupid muffin store.
But this place was your dream.
My real dream was to be a teacher, and you got me fired.
I assumed I'd never seen this episode before, and there are two explanations for why I knew this was going to happen. Either one, it's completely obvious where the story was going to go, or two, I actually had seen this episode before and I totally forgot everything that happened in it up until this point in the episode. And it wasn't just this one that this happened with. As I continued through episodes like The Squirt and the Whale, where Lisa tries to save a beached whale that's landed in Springfield, I realised, wait, I actually had seen not some of these, but all of season 21 and at least the first half of season 22 before. It took me a while to figure out whether I had seen them or whether I was getting deja vu, because a lot of these episodes were reiterations of Simpsons formulas that I recognised, and what I was watching was reminiscent of something like it from prior seasons, because the South Park Simpsons Did It assertion does still hold true. There are cases where you run into an episode that does the exact same thing as a Golden Age episode.
I've decided to give you all your inheritance now. I just want to see the look on your faces when I share with you the fruits of a lifetime of labor. So I've decided to give you your inheritance before I die. That way I can see you enjoy it.
But no, I realise now that I had seen all of these episodes many years prior to that 2015 watching session, but I just completely forgot them. And these aren't bad episodes I'm talking about here. I was particularly impressed by The Squirt and the Whale, but at the time, these episodes made absolutely no impact on me at all. I had this odd feeling with seasons 25 and 26 as well, and sometimes I had to seriously doubt myself. There was this one from season 26 where Mr. Burns starts fracking and he ends up sleeping with a Democratic politician who's trying to shut him down, and I swore I recognised it, but then I realised I was half remembering the plot about Jack and Cece from 30 Rock. This even happened when I got to season 27. I knew for a fact I'd seen all of these episodes before, but I only remembered a handful of them when I actually got here. It was like I was watching them for the first time, except for those occasional moments where I went, hang on a sec, I recognise that honeycomb-shaped barbecue grill, because I knew I had seen it, but I didn't remember seeing it. The repetitive nature of modern Simpsons is a really big problem. I was quite looking forward to seeing this season 32 episode, The 7-Beer Itch, because the guest star is Olivia Colman, who is a national treasure in the UK. The episode is a parody of the 1950s classic The 7-Year Itch, but given the plot is about Homer being tempted to cheat on Marge with this lady, I just couldn't stop thinking about The Last Temptation of Homer as I was watching it. And by the time the credits rolled, I just thought, given I've already seen The Last Temptation of Homer, what was the point in me watching that? And so I'm going to completely forget that I saw The 7-Beer Itch the second I finished talking about it. And in some ways, this effect is worse than an episode simply being bad. While reputationally speaking, the period between season 10 and the movie is notorious for being bad, Saddle Sore Galactica, Codependent State, and Homer vs. Dignity are like this triad of shit post-Golden Age episodes that are meant to speak for about 8 seasons of television when they actually don't. These are outliers. Seasons 10 to 18 are mostly fine. But my point is that these episodes make this period remarkable. How could one of the most beloved TV shows of all time make something as bad as Homer vs. Dignity? These episodes embody this period. People think it's all shit. It's not, but that's the impression that people have. Whereas post-movie Simpsons doesn't really generate that same visceral reaction that people had to The Principal and the Pauper. There's this baked-in view that post-Golden Age The Simpsons started sucking on a regular basis, but the general impression of post-movie Simpsons is that it's this blank space that anything could fit into. It could be just as bad as post-Golden Age Simpsons, it could have gotten good again. And that's what will later lead me on to the phenomenon of people remembering it's still going and trying it and are shocked to find it's apparently gotten good again once every few years. There is this anonymity in terms of modern Simpsons' general impression on the public. Post-movie you get some solid gold outliers like Eternal Moonshine, and yes there are still some negative outliers in the same vein as Homer vs. Dignity, but I have this theory about the negative outliers that disconnect them from the series. The now infamous episode from season 23, Lisa Goes Gaga, the one where Lady Gaga comes to Springfield, generated a backlash online, but it was a different kind of backlash to The Principal and the Pauper, because I get this sense from reading hate posts about it and watching hate videos about it that most of the backlash that this episode got was people watching it because they'd heard it was bad and wanted to hate watch it. Looking at the ratings on IMDb, most of the other episodes in season 23 have been rated about 1,500 times each. Lisa Goes Gaga has been rated 3,500 times. While no, this doesn't conclusively prove anything, I do think it's illustrative of my point that I just don't believe that most of the people that hated on the Gaga one watched all of season 23. They just watched the Gaga one just so they could join in the fun of publicly shitting on it. Principal and the Pauper came at a time when everyone was watching The Simpsons, so it stuck out from a mostly well-received show, whereas this came at a time when The Simpsons wasn't really that relevant to people. Because, face it, following the movie, who still had the enthusiasm left to be mad at, say, more than 1 or 2 bad Simpsons episodes every once in a while? It was repeating the same basic outlines of stories it did years ago and they all blurred into one, and the hatred for post-Golden Age Simpsons had reached saturation point. Anger is an exhausting emotion, and you can't retain it indefinitely. Aside from the odd internet trend, The Simpsons just wasn't generating enough enthusiasm from people to even be mad at it, let alone remember a good, bad, or just okay episode at all. To the point where years later, I can watch back a random episode, think it was okay, and then think to myself, wait, I saw that at the time, but I totally forgot about it. So obviously you'd think that any show failing to make an impact on an audience anymore would just end and that would be that. But of course, it didn't. It kept making basically the same episodes over and over again that are mostly fine but unremarkable. And this trend of it's the same episode continues to this day. In a fairly recent season 31 episode, Better Off Ned, Bart starts to bond with Ned in a recreation of that subplot in the Simpsons movie. Homer gets jealous and starts mentoring Nelson to get back at him, in basically the same outlines as Brother from the Same Planet from season 4. This criticism isn't all-encompassing, of course. As said, in some areas like the episodes I just mentioned, like Eternal Moonshine and the famous Lego animation episode, they did occasionally try innovative things to get people to consider the show relevant again. But the show mostly tried to keep itself relevant by linking itself to popular trends and celebrities. The Michael Jackson moment where the biggest pop star on the planet showed up in an episode to prove its relevance actually did continue during this period, even if nowhere near as many people were paying attention to it anymore or remembered episodes of it in the years that followed. The Simpsons' place as one of the most well-known shows on television meant that it still had enough cultural capital to be able to offer itself as a platform to celebrities who still considered it a viable means of selling themselves to a public that had largely stopped caring about the show. There's an argument to be made that in an ideal world, a piece of satire should be made with the target of your satire as far away from you as possible. One of the biggest issues is that direct involvement of the target of your satire may pollute the purpose to some degree, because when your piece relies on access to them, you might either pull your punches for fear of pissing them off and losing their cooperation, or you might accidentally end up promoting the people you're meant to be criticising. Because people watch it and they go, oh good, they can take a joke, that means they must be a good person. For anyone about to point out things like brass eye to me, I'm not saying this is a rule. What I'm saying is that proximity is dangerous to a satire because it makes these specific mistakes and a loss of dignity much more likely. The satirists that definitely fell victim to the accidental advertisement flaw were the British topical panel show Have I Got News For You, who invited Boris Johnson on the show with the aim of speaking truth to power. But what they actually did was they essentially declawed a sinister public figure to wide swathes of voters. So whether you're making fun of this guy directly to his face or not, it doesn't really matter. You've given the target of your satire a platform and they've made a positive impression on people. So is that satire or is it advertising? Personally, I think Boris Johnson's appearances on Have I Got News For You were accidental advertising. The Simpsons, on the other hand, is a much more difficult conversation to have. The Simpsons have always been used for advertising. Obviously, they did the Butterfinger commercials, and they even commented on the Simpsons merchandising boom in the show itself.
If there was any justice, my face would be on a bunch of crappy merchandise.
At the same time though, when the show had a point it wanted to make about a public figure, it didn't hold itself back for fear of pissing that public figure off. Stark Raving Dad doesn't pull its punches in satirising the Michael Jackson phenomenon and the public's reaction to his changing appearance, which is something that Jackson himself was probably quite sensitive about. They said this directly to his face.
Looney Tunes, this is what Michael Jackson looks like. You look like a big fat mental patient.
That being said, Stark Raving Dad doesn't come from a place of cynicism. Jackson sings a song at the end and ultimately leaves the experience with a positive impression on the audience, so it effectively advertises the celebrity while also satirising the culture surrounding that celebrity. Stark Raving Dad is sophisticated. It doesn't just have the Simpsons bow down before him and lick his shoes for 20 minutes. Jackson himself isn't the driving force of the story. Michael Jackson is stuck in the background of two actual stories about Homer being put in a psychiatric ward and Bart and Lisa falling out because Bart doesn't do anything for her birthday. And I know you're all going to be shocked to hear me say this, Lisa Goes Gaga tries to do something similar. Forget Lady Gaga for a minute, the main story in this episode is about Lisa being isolated at school because in typical Simpsons over-the-top fashion, she's voted the least popular student in a public assembly.
And now the award for least popular student, Lisa Simpson.
What? Least popular?
You probably should accept it, Lisa. They'll go easier on you if you do.
Thank you for noticing me. She actually accepted it.
Lady Gaga shows up in Springfield to inspire this little girl who needs someone to tell her that she's amazing. Lisa rejects Gaga and calls her a shallow, vacuous idiot to her face.
Here's what you're gonna do.
Why do you keep telling me what I'm gonna do? This isn't about me.
Well, who else would it be about?
You! Hello, Springfield! It's me, Gaga! Why is everyone looking at my purple hair full of bluebirds?
In Stark Raving Dad, Homer is ostracised at work because he doesn't fit in because he accidentally has a pink shirt and everyone else has a white shirt. He needs a sympathetic ear, and that sympathetic ear is a guy who claims he's Michael Jackson. Homer believes him because he doesn't know who Michael Jackson is. Jackson comes to their house, and Bart thinks he's a fraud and calls him out. Granted, structurally, Lisa Goes Gaga isn't even 100th as good as Stark Raving Dad, which separates Homer's struggle and Bart and Lisa's domestic dispute until it ties the two together at the end. And of course there's the difference that in this case they've written a character for the guest star. The guest star hasn't just shown up in Springfield as themselves and we're all meant to go, oh my god, that's a celebrity that I've heard of. I mean, they do that in Stark Raving Dad, of course, but the veil of fiction is much tighter because even if we all know that that's Michael Jackson, the story itself doesn't. Lisa Goes Gaga has the framework of something that might work. Although it's been done to death, Lisa the bullied little girl crying in her bedroom is a really powerful image that stuck around and resonated throughout the years for a very good reason. And if the show used that image to tell a story that cast Lady Gaga as a character, it could have been not as compelling as Stark Raving Dad obviously, but not the grade 5 train wreck that we know this episode as. Okay, maybe when Marge hears that Lisa is being bullied for being weird and different, she worries that Lisa's going to grow up to be an outcast. So she and Patty and Selma introduce her to a secret aunt that no one talks to because she's too weird and kooky, played by Lady Gaga. Which would be workable because The Simpsons does introduce distant unknown relatives all the time that we never see again. So Lisa goes and sees Lady Gaga as this unmentionable relative and finds her to be cool and unique and interesting, and the message is that you shouldn't care what other people think of you. Lisa goes and says this to Marge realises she was wrong, it's better that Lisa's an individual, she hugs her, and all is well. I'm not saying this episode should have literally been just that, but something like that probably wouldn't have left such a sour taste in people's mouths, because then people wouldn't feel like they're being advertised to. Sure, alright, every guest appearance is an advertisement to some degree, but if you build an episode around a guest star, it actually needs to do some work to hide the fact that it's built around that guest star. Because if it doesn't do that, and it's this blatant about it being a vehicle for the star, you ruin the purpose. And it feels like I'm just watching an advert that's less focused on telling a compelling story, and it's just trying to get me to go out and buy a product. Stark Raving Dad is an anti-celebration of Michael Jackson. Lisa Goes Gaga is just a celebration of Lady Gaga, and if I wanted that, I wouldn't be watching The Simpsons to see it. When mentioning hammy celebrity episodes of The Simpsons, it's impossible not to talk about the Elon Musk one from season 26. Yes, I know, I'm totally sick of talking about him as well, but it's a load-bearing episode for this and my next point. While yes, this episode is incredibly hollow, I do think it proves an interesting point about satire and celebrity cameos in the show. In the episode, Musk is stuck for any new ideas, and he ends up coming to Springfield where he makes friends with Homer, and then he teams up with Mr. Burns, the richest man in Springfield, but also the most evil man in Springfield. Yeah, why did they do that, guys? As much as this episode might feel like it's giving Elon Musk a tongue bath, them associating Musk with the local evil billionaire does mean something. And Musk's ideas end up bankrupting the power plant and might be good for the environment, but they put everyone out of a job and cause economic misery. It's almost like this episode is trying to say something here about how Musk's vision of the future is incompatible with the world that we live in.
And now he's landed in our yard, on my son's bike and on our mailman's leg. Honey, guess who crushed me? His first name is Elon. That's right.
Okay, yes, that is a terrible line, but what's literally happening in this scene? Elon Musk's spaceship is crushing an ordinary American worker. These images mean things. This episode actually makes a lot of sense read as a critique of Musk, because this period of The Simpsons is incredibly anti-billionaire, even more so than it used to be. Some of the jokes about billionaires aren't even jokes, they're literally just speaking truth to power.
Welcome to the American dream, a billionaire using public funds to construct a private playground for the rich and powerful.
The only problem, and this is why I bring up the Target issue, is that the point they clearly want to make with this episode can't get out, because someone's decided that they can't just have one of the regulars do an impression of Elon Musk. They have to have Musk himself, and if Musk himself is involved, then he has to be on side for it. He and his fans are known for being incredibly thin-skinned. If you're an Elon fan, feel free to prove me wrong by not getting pissed at me over this section. So any criticism of Musk has to be phrased like a compliment.
Wow, Elon, you're like Willy Wonka without the underpaid munchkins.
Okay, an analysis of that line that assumes complete innocence assigns a level of naivety to the writers that I just don't buy, considering the context of all the other episodes that I watched that came out during this period.
Think you're cool because you buy a $500 phone with a picture of a fruit on it? Well, guess what? They cost $8 to make, and I pee on every one!
Do you know they had a Justin Bieber cameo right at the height of the Justin Bieber sucks movement? It's only one line, and they're obviously pretty embarrassed about it. They include a meta-joke caption warning the viewer that a Justin Bieber cameo is coming and recommend switching off for it.
First of all, you're over 10 years old. Second, you're clearly Justin Bieber.
That's another $25 we'll never see. Gosh!
The show's distancing itself from a celebrity cameo here that someone's clearly made them do, so they've turned the fact that they have issues with doing this into a joke, and I do think that's what some of the writers are trying to do in the Musk episode. It's just come out sounding wrong. Because the problem is, I didn't come away from the Musk episode thinking about the nuanced points that it might have made if it hadn't sounded like a bunch of satirists being held hostage and being ordered to be nice about the incredibly rich and powerful man or else. The impression the Musk who fell to Earth wants you to come away with is not that the Elon Musk PR machine is hollow and empty. You're meant to come out of it thinking, Elon Musk is a big-brained sad boy that the world just isn't ready for. So it's not satire. It's there to solicit new members of the Elon Musk fan club. And the show does know it dropped the ball here. There's an episode in the following season that's entirely about how establishing a human colony on Mars is a stupid idea and nowhere near as close to happening as tech bros like Musk want you to think it is. It does feel like this entire episode was written as an admission that they screwed up the Musk one. Granted, you probably could argue that they would have chosen to satirise the infamous case of Mars 1 regardless of what happened, as it was ripe for satire. But given Musk's public statements about his pipe dreams regarding Mars, so far as topic selection goes, I do think he was probably mentioned at least once by someone in the writer's room. I did notice some really quite obvious buyer's remorse over Musk. There was an episode later in that season where Mr. Burns mentions the damage he did to the power plant.
Curse that Elon Musk. Thanks to that earth-smooching Batinsky, I'm on the verge of bankruptcy.
The modern show references Golden Age Simpsons all the time, but it's actually incredibly rare for it to mention events that happened inside the same season. This episode also had a cameo from Richard Branson in it, one of the other richest men in the world, and it's just a small cameo where The Simpsons is dismissive that an incredibly powerful person is guesting on it, and it doesn't take up the entire bloody runtime. Hey, look at that, they remembered how to do this properly. They admitted they screwed up with that episode again in a more recent season 35 episode about a shady tech startup CEO, which I was already thinking, this is about Elon Musk, isn't it? Even before they directly referenced the Twitter acquisition and made it clear that yes, we are talking about who you think we're talking about.
I bought you Twitter. The whole company. The previous owner had to sell it after his self-driving Mars rocket crashed into the International Space Station.
Fortunately, following this period, someone realised that episodes like The Musk Who Fell to Earth and the Gaga one, where a celebrity from the real world comes to Springfield, plays themselves, and the episode is primarily about the characters stopping the action to lick their boots every 15 seconds, are obnoxious as all hell, and everyone who was actually still watching The Simpsons hated them, so there legitimately was no point. So nowadays they usually write characters for the celebrities, or they make separate shorts on Disney Plus where they're not dragged out for 20 minutes and can easily be ignored if you can't be bothered to watch them. I'm a fan of Billie Eilish, but could you imagine if When Billy Met Lisa was more than just a glorified music video? Anyway, speaking of the Elon Musk one, this episode demonstrates my next point perfectly. The main thing that people get annoyed at the Musk Who Fell to Earth for is that Musk has always had an antagonistic relationship with the idea of unions, and yet Lisa is fangirling over him for the entire episode, which runs counter to one of the strongest Golden Age episodes, Last Exit to Springfield, where Lisa sang on the picket lines during the power plant strike, and yet in this episode she's giggling at the thought of spending time with Musk. The reason this doesn't work at all though becomes clearer when you see what they did to Smithers in this episode. This line still just mystifies me at how it made it into the final cut.
I don't trust Musk. Anyone with that much money has a darkness in his soul.
Now, yes, they do walk this line back in the very next line.
Says you.
However, regardless of whatever they say after this sentence still rings completely hollow when coming out of Smithers' mouth. In the first section of this video I talked about the nuance and different dimensions to the characters that started to appear because the show's been running for too long, but Homer's bad behaviour and Lisa's need to present a perfect exterior were deep rooted in their characters, and the darker impulses came out when the circumstances got out of control, and we're much more likely to believe their reactions now. But the core personality traits of these characters have remained the same, because if they didn't, your audience is going to have serious questions. And this holds true even for characters that are much more one note. Comic Book Guy is sarcastic and obsessive, Chief Wiggum is incompetent, Mayor Quimby is a sleazebag. Smithers is a deferential spineless lackey who worships the ground that a rich nuclear tycoon walks on. Lisa is an underdog who mistrusts the powerful. These roles do not work when done this way round.
He's not just my boss, he's my best friend too. Bah! Too hot! You're right, sir. It's scalding me as we speak.
I've never seen so much money. Oh, but I can't accept that, knowing where it came from.
Lisa should be distrustful of Musk, Smithers should spend this episode losing interest in Mr. Burns and being enamoured by this new big-brained rich sad boy in his life. which yes would also be painful to watch, but if you were gonna do an Elon Musk episode at all, you do it that way round. I know a Musk fan or two is probably going to point out to me that the reason they made Lisa identify with Musk is probably because of Musk's own backstory as a bullied child. Alright, if so, fair enough, but none of Musk's backstory as a bullied child is in the actual episode. I had a similar, albeit less extreme version of this problem in the season 21 episode, Postcards from the Wedge. Bart gets in trouble for not doing his homework, and Marge and Homer get told, and it creates a wedge issue between Homer and Marge, where Homer is outraged that Bart's not doing his homework, and Marge is too nice and thinks he's been given too much homework.
Till your homework is done, the only place your butt is safe from my foot is in that chair.
It's okay, Bart. Just do a couple vocabulary words and come have some milk and cookies.
While there are different sides to Homer and Marge's parenting styles, sometimes Marge is too nice and Homer is the disciplinarian. Well, if we count having serious anger issues as discipline.
Boy must die!
Which the show itself openly doesn't.
No, discipline would imply I'm trying to make him better.
Point is that Marge isn't a complete wet blanket where Bart is concerned. Two of my favourite episodes, Marge Be Not Proud and Bart the Mother, involve Marge being disappointed in him. And Homer can be strict sometimes, but he mostly lets Bart get away with murder.
Oh, I don't know how to punish you. What does Marge usually do?
She makes me taste beer.
It's like Postcards from the Wedge is an episode from a timeline where that weird episode from early season 1, No Disgrace Like Home, where Homer is the one who pushes his family into therapy and he's the one complaining about how terrible they are, became the blueprint for the show instead of going in the complete opposite direction.
I'm sorry, Marge, but sometimes I think we're the worst family in town.
There were some funny moments in Postcards from the Wedge, but my point is it just didn't feel right to me. It felt like the argument had been manufactured to make the point that Bart acts out in order to get attention, but the character's motivations in that argument felt inauthentic to me. In cases like that and the Smithers thing, it feels like misinterpretations of the characters are made just to get the story moving. This issue isn't the same as the show making minor changes to characters that I could imagine happening if this was a real person. I could imagine Barney realising he screwed his life up and trying to quit drinking. I couldn't imagine early Homer framing Marge for drunk driving, but by season 15 I could. Sure, latter-day Homer is a caricature of his early self, but a caricature is still an exaggeration of a trait that was already there to begin with. And to me, that incident didn't feel like an outright contradiction of who Homer was at this stage in the show's lifetime for the sake of the story. He is a dumb slob who does ridiculous self-serving things. But here it just felt wrong to me to show him as a strict parent. But the ultimate example of this issue is in the next episode I've picked out for discussion, and I'm calling it... I've seen all of them to date now, and the following example is the worst episode of The Simpsons. I've talked about episodes that I thought were bad before. Homer Simpson in Kidney Trouble has a major flaw in it. When You Dish Upon a Star was an undignified tongue bath for a collection of celebrities. The Musk and Gargo episodes were everything I just said. But I could remain a suitable level of detached with all of these to the point where I can say, okay, that was a bad episode, now I could just walk away and not think about it again. But the only episode I watched in 35 seasons that genuinely annoyed me and kept me annoyed for days afterwards was season 22, episode 17, Love is a Many-Strangled Thing. And it's probably because it actually had the potential to be a similar deconstruction of the show's tropes as Eternal Moonshine, and to be fair, at least half of it works. Homer humiliates Bart at a baseball game by tickling him on the Jumbotron until he wets himself, and everyone starts laughing at him. Then Homer goes to a parenting group to learn how to be a better father to Bart, where he casually admits to everyone that he strangles him, and everyone is quite naturally horrified.
So anyway, I'm strangling him, and I said to Bart...
Wait, hold on a moment. You were strangling your son?
Yeah, strangling. Right? Anyway, I said, Bart...
You're actually serious? You physically lay your hands on your boy's neck?
This is actually a great way of getting everyone to re-examine Homer in a modern context. And by drawing attention to the worst thing that Homer does on a regular basis and that he wouldn't be able to get away with if this wasn't a cartoon, it'd bridge the gap between the cartoon hyper-reality and the real world like the show's always been trying to do in some form or another in a new and interesting way.
You little... Hey, that's funny. And that horrible act of child abuse became one of our most beloved running gags.
Well, yeah. That's what the strangulation actually is, isn't it? But you don't recognise it as such because it's a cartoon. The strangulation doesn't seem weird or sinister in old Simpsons to us, but the reason it doesn't seem weird today is different to the reason it didn't seem weird in the early 90s. In the early 90s you see it as, it's a cartoon, and it's the Simpsons' take on over-the-top cartoon hyperreality. It always used to have Itchy and Scratchy in there to draw your attention to just how violent cartoons can be and how you don't recognise it as such because it's a drawing. Even though in the Simpsons universe, this cartoon doesn't look any different to the quote-unquote real world.
Yeah, but it's just pretend violence.
But it's not though, is it, Bart? Because you're a cartoon as well. How does a cartoon differentiate itself from an in-universe cartoon? The strangulation also works on that level for us out here in the actual real world, and you got to remember that the original point of The Simpsons was that it's a show about a real family that just happens to be a cartoon. This definition admittedly got stretched, but taking that into consideration, you understand where the strangulation comes from and why it's there, because in prior decades, kids would actually get physically punished for doing something bad. My parents never did it to me, but I remember that discourse over is it okay to smack children as a punishment was still going on as late as the mid-90s while I was growing up. Nowadays, corporal punishment is pretty unthinkable to most people, and they're much more likely to go, what the hell is wrong with you if you admit that you do it. But in the 90s, the strangulation of Bart was a comical exaggeration of the sort of thing that lots of audience members would probably remember from their own childhoods. So that's why it made sense to do it. But in a modern context, the only reason that Homer strangling Bart doesn't seem strange or alien to us is because, yeah, it's a cartoon, and the idea of it being a real family that just happens to be a cartoon got lost a long time ago, but mostly it doesn't seem weird because it's what The Simpsons has always done. This
Boy must die!
I love you, Dad!
Is completely normal to us. And this episode is here to draw attention to that. So the therapist decides that something has to be done to fix Homer's compulsion to strangle Bart, and so he gets random guest Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to put on a Homer costume and strangle Homer on a regular basis. And that psychologically breaks him. Now that Homer knows what it's like to be in Bart's shoes, he's incapable of strangling him. I did actually like all of this stuff. The first half of the episode was an interesting piece of self-reflection on the part of the show where it puts its past glories through a modern lens. So why am I saying this is the first episode that pissed me off? Well, because then Bart realises that he can get away with anything, and so he treats Homer like dirt.
Fill the board, then wash my car.
These are my keys.
What was that?
This is the thing that you kind of expect of a story like this where Homer is rendered incapable of doing his usual bad parenting. But the problem is that Bart's long-held characterization, as I explored in my Golden Age video, is that he actually is highly moral. But he just can't help himself from being bad. Bart doesn't want to cause chaos and hurt people for no reason. The issue is that he just can't help himself. But in this episode, he's a malevolent little monster who wants to cause Homer as much pain as possible just because he realises that he now can. Or he just doesn't care whether Homer lives or dies. As in the climax where Homer is being hanged on a tree in an experiment set up by the therapist to see if Bart will do anything, and Bart could save him, but he just doesn't care.
Well, anything?
Can't look. Texting.
Jesus, that's depressing. And my point is that that's not who Bart is at all. You could get away with this episode making Bart into the worst kid that ever existed if it was painted as Bart getting revenge on Homer for the wetting himself incident or all the times he's been strangled. These events aren't linked up at all, which is a really weird mistake, and it's hard to understand why they've made it. They link up the events in Barting Over from season 14. Bart gets emancipated after he learns that Homer took all the money that he earned from a commercial that he was in when he was a baby.
You stole my money!
See, he's got a direct reason for going on the attack when it comes to Homer. But the motivation for Bart's mistreatment of Homer in Love is a Many-Strangled Thing doesn't come from anywhere. It doesn't try and offer anything in the way of a reason for Bart's behaviour. Or Homer's for that matter. The episode treats Homer's strangulation of Bart as a compulsion that he has, not a mismanaged anger response. But outside of that first look of horror from the other fathers and the therapist, it ultimately doesn't even condemn the strangulation. Because it can't. because the conclusion has to be to reset to the status quo again, because the episode has clearly resolved to not give up the strangulation before it even starts. But if you were going to tell this story at all, if you were going to address the fact that strangulation looks weird in a modern context, that's the right thing to do, isn't it? You may be aware of a recent controversy in a season 35 episode where it was implied that the show has phased out Homer strangling Bart.
Whoa, that's quite a grip.
See, Marge? Strangling the boy has paid off. Just kidding, I don't do that anymore. Times have changed.
Of course, if you actually watch that episode in the context of it being a story and not in the context of looking for some talking points, you'd realise that Homer obviously says that because he's trying to impress his new neighbours. However, I was at around season 27 in this watch through around the time that controversy was going on, and it did make me realise that they weren't really using the strangulation that much as the years wore on. It goes from happening multiple times a season to once or twice by around season 26, and when they use it, it's usually in the context of a historical story or a vision or a daydream. I get why someone would watch this and think they had phased it out, because essentially they had already, and no one had noticed, because again, people just haven't been paying proper attention to The Simpsons' current output for years now. They recently responded to that controversy within the show itself with the season 36 premiere, Bart's Birthday. It's one of those meta premises where Conan O'Brien hosts an episode billing itself as the final Simpsons episode, where they get an AI to generate a final episode of The Simpsons where Mr. Burns dies and all the characters in Springfield start moving on with their lives in some way and changing, and Bart has an existential crisis about turning 11. I really recommend this one. It reminds me a lot of the Stanley Parable in the way the world appears to be fighting a story that's been foisted upon it by some higher power. It ends with Bart defying the proposed conclusion of the show by baiting Homer into strangling him again, and that breaks the reality generated by the AI, and means that this isn't the final episode after all, and they get to continue on as normal. What it's essentially saying here is that an AI will write something designed to be perfect, but as the episode demonstrates with its uncomfortable tone, it feels unnatural. So Bart breaks the AI by getting Homer to enact this flawed and outdated joke. On one level, it's a defiant statement against media commentators taking that line about times having changed to mean more than it apparently does, but on another level, it's acknowledging that yes, the strangulation doesn't make sense to do now. If the show was perfect, as an AI is designed to be, it wouldn't be there. But they weren't ready to phase it out at the time of Love is a Many-Strangled Thing. I get why people got annoyed with the idea of phasing out the strangling, because people understandably get upset when a show that's just as much a part of their living room as their furniture changes, but it's not as if the show is a complete stranger to change. It killed off Maud Flanders, Apu got married and had 8 kids, Lisa became a vegetarian, but some changes to the core of the show are actually more necessary as a means of adapting it to changing times. It is okay to change things sometimes because that will mean the show is still true to the original spirit of the characters while remaining in tune with the current state of the world that it's there to satirise. In a modern context, the strangulation doesn't work that well, and it's clearly a product of its time, and you'd think that that would be what Love is a Many-Strangled Thing is here to say and to draw a line under it. Ideally, the end of this episode would be Homer and Bart mutually realising how unhealthy their relationship is, and Homer resolves to never strangle him again, and that's how they phase the strangling out, while resetting to the status quo of a messed up relationship between a parent and a child to a certain extent, but never going that far back to the strangulation. But this episode has the same problem as an Apu episode that we're going to talk about in a bit, where it's clearly decided that it doesn't want to change before it starts, and if you don't want to change this aspect of the show, you can't tell this story. I know that since this section is titled Forgetting What the Characters Are For, someone is going to try and point out to me that phasing out something the show always used to do is technically forgetting what the characters are for, and if that is your argument, you're ignoring the point. The point of Love is a Many-Strangled Thing is made in that first scene with the therapist. It's there to highlight how the world has changed around the show, so something it always did so casually now looks weird. But the hurdle it's fallen at is that the only way that it can keep the thing that it always did is to thoroughly mangle the character of Bart. The resolution is that Bart angers the therapist so badly that the therapist starts strangling Bart, and that's how to get Bart to help his father when he's in the noose.
See? You see how that boy pushes your buttons?
We'll talk when he's dead!
So therefore, Bart should be strangled, because he is bad and it's the only way he learns. Are you sure that's what you want the moral of the story to be? This episode was a good idea, it's a great opportunity for the show to evolve, but if you wanted to address the disconnect between a cartoon that features this kind of violence and recognising that that kind of violence is violence, you can't have this be the conclusion. For anyone about to misinterpret what I'm saying here, I'm not saying they have to give up the strangulation, I'm not offended by it or anything. What I'm saying is that drawing attention to it like this means the conclusion to give it up becomes inevitable. And giving it up entirely would make more sense than making it so Bart deserves it. The Simpsons has always seemed like a show where it can do anything it wants and it doesn't matter what the story is. There are no limits, and to an extent that's true, but some things you shouldn't do just because you want the story to be told in a certain way or to reach a specific conclusion. Change is good, change is healthy. The Simpsons of the 90s and the Simpsons of the modern day are very different. Styles of comedy change, society changes, but there are certain fundamentals of who the characters are that need to stay the same while ditching the bits that don't make sense anymore. There was a much better episode in season 28 that I really enjoyed called The Cat and the Hat. It's one of those simple but effective sitcom plots. Lisa's got a new hat, she loves it, she falls asleep on the car ride home, and Bart randomly decides to throw the hat away because of his instinct where he just can't help himself from doing something bad. And then he's haunted for the rest of the episode by a monster played by Patton Oswalt who represents his guilt.
I'm your guilt.
I don't have any guilt.
You do now.
Don't worry, Bart, I'll protect you. I'm denial.
It reminded me of earlier, more abstract Simpsons, particularly the Telltale Head. The emotional core worked really well for me, and it's easily the more interesting way of dealing with Bart's bad behaviour than a simple "Bart is a monster." It looks at his behaviour from Bart's perspective. Here's the thing about these character done wrong complaints though. You will probably all be familiar with this argument that I've been gesturing towards that people commonly make about The Simpsons in the modern era that's usually phrased like this. The new writers don't understand the characters. Whether they do or don't is not my business to say, and I feel the wording of this complaint often feels like a personal attack on these often unnamed new writers. Like, who are we talking about here? Whose fault is it that they've come out sounding this way? Because you weren't in that writer's room, were you? This is why I'm treading so delicately around this issue, because I don't know. What I've mentioned so far in this section are mostly random examples out of many, many more instances of them getting the characters right, and there are probably explanations for all of these problem episodes. While I did just dismiss the explanation for Lisa being made to identify with Musk because of Musk's backstory as a bullied child, that is highly likely to be the explanation for why those roles were done the wrong way round. We need a character to distrust Musk when he teams up with Burns. What character is around Burns all the time? Smithers. It's clearly a mistake caused by the need for a quick turnaround in content. The Simpsons is still making 22 episodes a year when most cartoons have scaled back from the industrial scale of the old network TV model that The Simpsons is still stuck in. And that need for a quick turnaround is probably the explanation behind other issues like the disconnect between the trigger event of Love is a Many-Strangled Thing and its conclusion. If I felt like it was worth my time or yours, maybe I would tabulate every episode with every character and check off whether they were done right according to me, but it just wouldn't be worth it. So let me just say, this problem of forgetting what the characters are for is there, but it's not representative of the whole experience. And when people say the new writers don't understand the characters, I do feel it's usually said by people who've just seen the odd new episode or two. Like people who specifically hate watch Lisa Goes Gaga just so they could join in with the cultural conversation. Yes, I've dedicated an entire section to this phenomenon, but sometimes episodes like The Cat in the Hat, or the superb A Totally Fun Thing that Bart will never do again, get him really, really right. Sometimes episodes like Love is a Many-Strangled Thing get him really, really wrong. But I do see how this opinion has developed. As opposed to one case where I think people are being completely unreasonable with the following incredibly controversial episode that there's no two ways about it, I have to dedicate an entire chapter to it. That 90s show, not the sequel to that 70s show, the Simpsons episode from about 15 years ago, was season 19's flashback episode. This time it shows Homer and Marge dating in the 90s. They have a fallout and they get back together after Homer has a successful career as a rock star, doing some really quite cringy pastiches of famous Nirvana songs. People hated this episode, and looking back at the reactions from the time, I saw a lot of people claiming that they hated it because they were used to Homer and Marge being teenagers in the 70s and then having Bart and Lisa in the 80s.
Things happened between your mother and me that we're not proud of. It was the middle of a wild decade known as the 1990s.
The 90s? Never heard of it.
This was probably the last great Simpsons controversy before people stopped caring about its current output and only came back occasionally to prod it with a massive stick over episodes like the Lady Gaga one. Like Principal and the Pauper, that 90s show openly acknowledges the fact that it's changing something, but regardless of whether you openly address it, if you change the audience's preconceived notions, they are going to hate it. The thing I want to point out though is, did they change those preconceived notions that much? Was the change to the timeline that was made in that 90s show really as meaningful as it was made out to be? Because The Simpsons has always had a very loose relationship with its own timeline because it has to. There's no other way around it, because everyone always stays the same age, and there's no end date in sight. By 2008, Bart and Lisa now have to be born in the late 90s to the year 2000 if they're still 10 and 8 years old in the present day. And the shifting of the timeline started a long time before that 90s show. In the Season 2 episode The Way We Was, Homer and Marge are high school seniors in 1974, implying that they were both born around 1956. We then see Homer's driver's license in this Season 4 episode, clearly showing his birth date. But then in this episode, Doin' in the Wind in Season 10, we flash back to child Homer, presumably about 5 or 6 years old here, playing in the mud at Woodstock in 1969.
But I want to play in the mud and be a hippie!
But he's supposed to be 17 or 18 years old 5 years later. That doesn't add up, does it? Lisa's first word in Season 4 opens presumably around the time of Lisa's conception, so Bart is supposed to be about 1 or 1.5 around the time of
Last episode of MASH?
Putting Bart's date of birth at about 1981 or 82. And yet at the age of 10, he watches the Smashing Pumpkins performing the song Zero in Homerpalooza in Season 7. But that song wasn't performed live until 1995, by which time Bart should be 13 or 14. Oh my god, I hope somebody got fired over that blunder. Okay, I'm not going to drudge up any more of these examples because frankly, the timeline does not matter. This was always going to happen if you got a show commenting on current events and real celebrities where the characters are always supposed to be roughly the same age. Springfield has always existed in this weird Twilight Zone type place where time passes but no one ages in the way they usually do in the real world. Sometimes they're young, sometimes they're not. Time just moves differently in Springfield.
It all began 6 years ago. The president of back then was the president. The popular music of those times was all the rage.
Then you got to remember the framing devices for the flashback episodes are usually Homer and Marge telling the kids stories from their pasts, so you do have the excuse of the unreliable narrator here. When recounting past events, people do forget things, exaggerate or embellish truths, because they're not necessarily just trying to give you the facts. The point of telling these stories is to evoke an emotion in you. Parents telling their kids the story of how they met and fell in love aren't going to be able to communicate the point of the story if a kid's just sticking their hand up at various intervals and going, "Wait mum, if you were born in 1979 and I was born in 1989, that would make you 10 years old when I was born. You're lying about your age, you scam artist." The fine details aren't the point, the emotion is the point. Though I will admit that 90s show does look weird, because The Simpsons is one of the most famous TV shows ever, the golden age is inextricably tied to the 90s, and so I understand why the idea of a 90s iteration of Homer and Marge before kids seems weird to people, because it does clash with our collective understanding of The Simpsons as a cultural artifact. I will never get used to seeing any of the Simpsons family with smartphones. You're The Simpsons, it's the 90s. Mobile phones should be the size of your head. As an experiment in turning The Simpsons from being a show from the 90s into a show that's nostalgic about the 90s, I do kinda respect the attempt. Now, that being said, yes, that 90s show is a really, really bad episode, and I wouldn't disagree with people putting it on worst lists purely on the basis of it being bad. I just think that this reason that people usually give for it being bad is a real stretch. I didn't feel anything while watching it because the college professor that Marge falls for is quite blatantly supposed to be a slimeball, and not a real competitor for her affections. Yes, we all know that by nature of this being a flashback episode that the episode's going to end with her getting back together with Homer, but if we're not even given a reasonably believable threat to her future with Homer, then what even is the point of this story at all? If he was a real competitor, then this might have been compelling, but every line is written and delivered like you're supposed to want to punch this guy in the face.
But Homer's so supportive. He's paying for me to go to college.
He's paying for you, like he owns you. I'm sorry, but that is oppression. Marge, your assignment is to think about what I have said about your relationship.
Like Homer Simpson in Kidney Trouble, there's no grey area, and so I'm just not invested in it at all. While I didn't like this episode, I think it is a good thing for the show to prove that it's got a fluid relationship to its own timeline. It allows it to engage with a wider range of culture than would have been possible if it was rigidly enforced that Homer and Marge dated in the 70s, then had kids in the 80s. I was in my late teens around the time this episode aired, and grunge was still relevant to teenagers at the time, as it was the moody progenitor of the emo and indie rock that we were all listening to in the late 2000s. In the capacity of trying to fit modern Simpsons into that cultural context, that 90s show makes sense as a creative move, because The Simpsons isn't just a cultural artifact of the 90s, it's also a continuous show. So the show basically wanting to tell its own version of the Nirvana story does make sense to me, and it leads me to the following discussion. I mentioned in my post-Golden Age video, an episode I'm still particularly fond of from season 12 is the Computer War Menace Shoes, which features an extended parody of the surreal British 60s show The Prisoner, but done in a way where you don't actually have to be aware of the source of the parody. And this was the thing that got me to go and check out The Prisoner and made me into a fan. Effectively like an advert. But given this is cultural influence here, I think there's much more merit to things like this than just having a popular celebrity show up in Springfield and having the characters licking their shoes for 20 minutes. The Simpsons has always been woven out of movie references, the most obvious being the Treehouse of Horror parodies, but the main show itself is full of these little homages to famous movies.
I want my Eddie.
The main thing I noticed moving into the modern era was just how obscure some of these parodies and homages are, and that's when I remembered that along with The Simpsons getting me into The Prisoner, The Simpsons was also what got me reading Edgar Allan Poe, and this lined up with my memories of being shown episodes of The Simpsons in various classes at school. If you use familiar popular characters as the vehicle, then you can encourage people to engage with wider forms of culture, instead of staying in the narrow lane of network TV, and that's where I think The Simpsons is at its most admirable. When your show's this big and famous, using it to get more people reading or watching niche cultural stuff is a noble purpose. Sure, it may seem strange and out of nowhere when in Treehouse of Horror 17 you think, wait, they're doing a parody of a 1920s German expressionist film? But the point isn't that they expect you to know what they're parodying. The purpose of the parody is to get you to engage with the source material. One of the finest and most beautifully random examples of this is the Itchy and Scratchy parody of the experimental non-narrative art house film Koyaanisqatsi. Koyaanisqatsi is basically an unconventional documentary about man's impact on nature done without dialogue. The Simpsons is one of the most successful animated comedies ever made. These two pieces of intellectual property are absolutely nothing alike, and yet if you're a casual viewer, you can just watch this parody, take it or leave it, but a small cross-section of the audience will then go and check out Koyaanisqatsi, love it, and continue to engage with experimental films. Maybe it'll encourage them to seek a career in filmmaking that breaks new ground, and that is a beautiful thing. That's a purpose for The Simpsons' continued existence. In this sense, this is essentially The Simpsons as public service broadcasting. By encouraging people to engage with wider forms of culture, it's providing a service that benefits society. Granted, dedicated public service broadcasters like the BBC are publicly owned and funded, and that's obviously the antithesis of commercial broadcasters like Fox. It's only really possible for the show to do this because The Simpsons is this big and famous and can essentially do whatever it wants. If this was any other show pitching an extended Koyaanisqatsi parody, a network executive would say, no, because it's not got any kind of popular appeal, no one's gonna get it. A public service broadcaster wouldn't need to worry about whether it's got any kind of popular appeal, but The Simpsons is in a unique position to get away with it on a commercial broadcaster. Even though, like any other show, they're reliant on the network to keep it going, they did essentially build Fox, and they know it, and they are comfortable flexing that fact from time to time.
And then I had this dream that my whole family was just cartoon characters, and that our success had led to some crazy propaganda network called Fox News.
I find it truly inspiring that a mainstream show on a commercial broadcaster like The Simpsons can act to improve society through its encouragement of its audience to engage with wider forms of culture by peppering it with more obscure homages and references. This purpose has allowed a lot more freedom in the couch gags, which start getting much more elaborate around this period. And these couch gags are the main reason you should never click skip intro on The Simpsons, because if you do, you're usually missing the best part of the episode. Everyone knows about the Banksy couch gag, of course, but they also get a wider array of really interesting animators to do them. I really like this one by Don Hertzfeld, where it flashes forward thousands of years into the future where the show still hasn't been cancelled or ended yet, and the style of The Simpsons has evolved so drastically over the years that it's barely comprehensible gibberish.
Don't have cow, man! I am Simpson! Don't have cow, man! I am Simpson!
An episode about Lady Gaga doesn't really serve this purpose of introducing its audience to a wider form of culture because everyone already knows who she is. Did you really need The Simpsons to go, did you know about this book series called Harry Potter? It's kind of cringe-inducing sometimes when you watch it cover cultural fixtures that are relevant in pop culture because it's clear it doesn't come from a place of genuine enthusiasm on the part of the creative team. It's just, what's popular? Let's do that. Or, as is the case with the Justin Bieber cameo, clearly foisted on them by someone at the network. Because even though The Simpsons is a bigger deal show than most, there's always some push and pull in these things. But when I watch scenes like Koyana Scratchy, I see someone who loves the source material and wants more people to know about it, and has managed to convince everyone on staff and the network that it's worth doing. Sometimes it is a bit odd and out of kilter. Like in this episode where Bart has a dream about how he wants a younger brother, there's an extended bit dedicated to the Smothers Brothers, an American comedy duo from the 60s. And it goes on for way too long and I started to tune out, but I didn't begrudge them for it because it obviously comes from a place of love and someone on the staff wishing more people knew about them. And whether this bit goes on for too long or not, I just ended up thinking, yeah, you know what, fair enough. I'm happy that this is here. Sometimes it fits incredibly well and feels truly inspired. There was this episode from season 30 where Marge and Homer go on a reality show and get kicked out on the first day, and they have to go and live at this hotel while the series wraps because the network don't want spoilers getting out. Marge gets depressed and it randomly turns into a parody of the classic Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor film Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And Dan Castellaneta and Julie Kavner are really given free rein to truly flex as voice actors.
What a dump. What's that from?
What?
What a dump.
How would I know?
What a dump. Hey, what's that from? What a dump.
How would I know? You were right in there, Nick. Right at the meat of things.
There's no limit to you, is there?
People by and large weren't really paying as much attention to The Simpsons by this point, and that may sound like it can only be a bad thing. And it can be a bad thing, yes, but it can also be a good thing. The stakes being lower means it's actually got a lot more freedom to do odd and out of nowhere things, and it using that freedom to fold wider cultural influences into the show, I think that's beautiful. Anyway, speaking of how people weren't really paying as much attention anymore, that leads me to a conversation that keeps coming round every few years or so. Okay, this discussion is going to take a while, so please bear with me. In my video on the post-Golden Age, I argued that at a certain point, The Simpsons stopped feeling like real people. As much as cartoon characters can feel like real people, and that makes the show much more fragile. Because the show's success, and the respect that I hold for it, is rooted in the idea formed in the show's earlier, more sincere first few seasons, that when I watch Homer and Marge fight, I'm watching a real married couple fight. When I watch Bart fail at school, I'm watching a real kid fail at school. And this vanishes when you watch too much of The Simpsons and you become hyper-aware of its formulas. Well, along with the déjà vu, another weird thing started to happen as I continued through, and this brings me back to the affection that I found for a season 17 episode that most people think of as fairly unremarkable regarding Margie. Even though Homer stopped feeling like a real person a long time ago, I still felt warm and fuzzy when Marge starts falling for him again, despite having forgotten who he is.
I still don't remember you, but for the first time since this happened, I wish I did, Homer.
So I knew that going into the modern era, I'd have to circle back on the question, how did the show do that? By this point I'd watched Homer behave like a complete monster, and I'd become so desensitised to his antics that I just saw him as chaos in man form, not a real human being anymore. And yet when he said this, I suddenly felt something again.
You just walked away from the sweetest, most beautiful woman a guy could want. There's a light inside her that makes everyone else look better.
This happened again with Eternal Moonshine, as I mentioned earlier, and this leads me back to what I talked about in my Golden Age video regarding how Marge and Homer's marriage is cemented as completely indestructible in spite of just how horrible Homer obviously is. To make this work, you have to have some of the most downright heartfelt moments ever written. I'm not saying this is the most heartfelt thing ever written, but it is trying to tap that similar seam of realistic emotions that the early years in the Golden Age did so well. The Simpsons can't sustain itself purely on jokes. It sustains itself on jokes and really tiny little simple displays of sincere emotion. What Homer says there was just enough to break through my developed view of Homer that had built up over the course of at least the previous 7 seasons, so I could see the real person that he used to be in the early days underneath. This show is almost entirely built around the ability of Homer to justify his terrible behaviour with a "but I love you though," which the show had noticed that it couldn't do anymore and had begun to deconstruct by the time of the movie. It's dangerous for the show to be this open about Homer's almost completely vanished sense of realism, yes, but my point is that humble moments of emotion means that while in a broader context the show doesn't work anymore, but in singular isolated incidents like this, the show can still work. Another example, in an episode I just referred to called Oh Brother Where Bart Thou from season 21, not to be confused with the season 2 episode Oh Brother Where Art Thou. Yeah, with hundreds of episodes under their belt, they're really running low on potential names now. Hey, does anyone want to watch the season 22 episode Flaming Moe, not to be confused with the season 3 classic Flaming Moes? In Brother Where Bart Thou, Bart sees the bond that Lisa and Maggie have because they're sisters, and he decides he wants a baby brother. So he comes up with schemes to get Marge and Homer to have another baby. It's nowhere near Golden Age level of emotional sincerity, and a lot of scenes are flabby and overwritten, but I was genuinely taken aback by this episode. I felt like I was watching a real 10-year-old apply a 10-year-old's logic to solving an emotional problem that he's run into that he can't fix by lashing out.
I just wanted what Lisa and Maggie have.
Oh, Barty, I'm sorry.
I'd help you take care of them.
Remember those hamsters you were going to take care of?
Oh my god, the hamsters!
There's the odd episode where he's done very wrong in my opinion, like Love is a Many-Strangled Thing, but most of the time, Bart is probably the strongest character that survives the desensitization period. I was still spotting moments that really worked across these seasons.
I thought teachers only went outdoors to smoke and cry.
That line could have come directly out of a Matt Groening Life in Hell comic from the 80s. The roots of the show that you're all wistful and nostalgic for are still in here all these years later.
Moments of pure joy always have consequences.
We already knew that.
Yeah, why do you think we exist?
This quality of isolated moments of realism is the main reason why Holidays of Future Past from season 23 worked so well. Like Eternal Moonshine, this episode's held up as one of the few good Simpsons episodes from the modern era that people still remember. Flash forward episodes where we see what the kids are like as adults were nothing new, and this one itself is nothing new. Lisa's wedding from season 6 was the main blueprint for the flash forward episodes. Future Drama from season 16 was another similar comically exaggerated future, where scientists have invented magic, and Homer and Marge have split up, and now he lives in a house at the bottom of the sea. Oh god. Sorry, tangent, I just got something.
Under the sea, under the sea.
Homer, that's your solution to everything, to move under the sea. It's not gonna happen.
But it does happen! He does end up living under the sea. I did not realise that was a callback. But yeah, Future Drama inspired mild praise from people, whereas Holidays of Future Past perfects the formula by going further into the future and showing Bart as a deadbeat dad, and Homer, who's now been sober for years, is presented as a more emotionally aware grandparent. This episode clicks with people because it's pure Simpsons Golden Age. It combines absurd, joke-based world building and an emotionally sincere framework that makes you think of them as real people again, in spite of just how ludicrous that world building is. Well, I had had my view of these characters as real people that just happen to be cartoons almost completely broken by this point. When the writing is strong enough and heartfelt enough, I can get invested again. One episode I recommend everyone watching this video check out that they probably won't have seen before is Halloween of Horror from season 27. An episode that I did see back when it was new because, as mentioned, I watched all of season 27 out of curiosity when it came out. Treehouse of Horror was initially designed as an out-of-character experiment that subverts what you expect of a Simpsons episode, but then it became tradition and it wasn't surprising anymore. So by season 27, they've realised that and they subvert our expectations this Halloween by doing a regular Simpsons episode set at Halloween. By being a normal episode, it's technically out of character, which is a nice twist. Lisa gets lost at a Halloween fair and her trauma from this experience means she can't handle Halloween anymore, and she seeks comfort in a little fake animal tail that she calls Taily. This image of Lisa shut up in her room stroking this little fuzzy bit of material that she's given a name and imagines protects her connected me with my own inner child and reminded me of when I was a scared little kid that couldn't handle the dark. It's a really powerful image.
So, Taily's back.
Taily just makes me feel so safe. I don't know why I ever gave it up.
Halloween of Horror is a very simple story about Homer and Marge struggling to parent their child, and under other circumstances you might not think much of it, but my point is that Lisa feels like a real 8-year-old here, and Homer and Marge feel like real parents concerned for their child's well-being. And the interesting point is that I had those feelings in spite of having seen episodes like the one where she got a restraining order against Bart. As mentioned with The Principal and the Pauper, there is an extent to which you can view episodes in isolation. This Lisa isn't really the same Lisa as the one who's an Elon Musk fan. I'd like it if the show did things like this more often to give me a more coherent whole experience, but when just viewing episodes like this one, these small powerful images can be incredibly effective in spite of your ingrained view of the show at this point as having been on too long and lost its way over 2 decades ago. The thing is though, it working in isolation can be a positive and a negative, because you recognise the pattern. Halloween of Horror may have really spoken to me, but given I had experience by the end of season 27 of occasionally being surprised by a Simpsons episode, even if I had an extremely positive reaction to this one, I knew it wouldn't last long. And this is how we get to the phenomenon of everyone occasionally going, is The Simpsons good again? Which I am certain you are all aware of. Every season or two it's supposed to have gotten good again, because someone in a big media outlet's watched it again and noticed some emotional sincerity in one of the occasional really strong episodes that they just happened to watch by random chance, because a stopped clock is right twice a day. And they continued to watch The Simpsons and found that it's still competent, and they started telling everybody that it's good again. This happened with me when I watched season 27 by random chance in 2015. I went around telling all my friends that The Simpsons has gotten good again, and they nodded and smiled and largely didn't bother listening to me. People have claimed to me because they knew that I was watching the entire thing, and this seems to be widely believed in reporting on the show, that season 33 sees the start of a new Simpsons Renaissance, because that was the season that Al Jean, who had overseen the show since season 13, handed over showrunner duties to Matt Selman, who, and this is not a dig, but I do need to point out, has been writing on the show for the entire time it's supposed to have been bad. Yes, his name's on most of the really good ones made in that time. People say that Selman being the new showrunner is the sudden cause of a quality increase because they like to think that they know how the internal process of TV writing works, even though, again, you weren't in those writers' rooms. The only clues that we have that something's different are the names have changed. Yes, alright, sometimes you can tell, season 4 of Community feels obviously very different with the absence of Dan Harmon and it's not as good. But in the case of The Simpsons, and remember, I was steamrolling through these seasons over the course of several weeks at the time, and at a functional level, I could barely tell much of a difference when the change happens. Yes, after season 32 I noticed more gimmick episodes than before and remembered the headlines that appeared on my social media feeds whenever I ran into one of them, but the odd episode or two aside, the show is still largely telling the same stories it's been telling for years. Is this completely unremarkable season 33 episode, The Longest Marge, where Beck Bennett plays a football player who Marge and Burns fight over, part of the new Simpsons Renaissance?
You've got to choose, my boy. Me or her.
Can't you see? You're tearing me apart!
Or this season 34 episode where Krusty opens a clown school and Fat Tony gets involved. That sounds familiar. There's tons of episodes from the current Selman period that could have come from season 28, 29, 30, 31 or 32. Yep, sorry everybody, there is nothing in this new Simpsons Renaissance period. Sometimes people happen to watch something good purely by chance, sometimes it's bad. A few episodes before Lisa Goes Gaga, there was an episode called A Totally Fun Thing That Bart Will Never Do Again. It's about the Simpsons going on a cruise, and Bart wants the holiday to last forever, so he orchestrates a hoax where everyone's made to believe there's a pandemic on land, so they have to remain at sea indefinitely. This one is hilarious, has heart, and a great moral for Bart that fun and good times are nice, but they can't last forever. And this one is just as good as, maybe not any episode from seasons 4 and 5, but at least as good as most of seasons 8 and 9. If you switch The Simpsons on and happen to see this one, you'd think it's gotten good again. If you happen to switch it on and see Lisa Goes Gaga, you'd think it's just as bad as it's supposedly been since the early 2000s. This new Simpsons Renaissance is largely a case of the stopped clock is right twice a day. Because here's the thing, how many of the people who've returned and said, wow, The Simpsons is good again, have been watching the entire time? Can you really say it's good again if you fell off the show at season 16 and then picked it up again at season 27 like I assumed that I did? What if seasons 24 and 25 were good again and you missed them? Theoretically, you should only be able to say it's good again if you've been watching the entire time and can actually track the quality of it. But admit it, people don't do that. And also theoretically, if The Simpsons gets good again, then people should stay watching after an episode like Halloween of Horror surprises them. I stayed tuned to season 27 in 2015, tuned out again when I didn't realise that season 28 had started, and I just forgot about it. And I lost track again, and suddenly there were hundreds of episodes that I'd never seen. The Simpsons is good again is usually an opinion that's not backed by the complete context of the show as it stands now as over 700 episodes sitting there unwatched on a Disney Plus account. Because given just how long it took me to catch up with the show, I do not believe that even 10% of the people that have said the words The Simpsons is good again have watched the entire thing. It can't be a case of is it good again when, as far as you're aware, it could have always been good. Or it could have been good again for a few years already, but you just weren't enthusiastic enough to watch the show continuing to do basically what it always did for an unspecified amount of time. Context is everything in discussions like is The Simpsons good again, and yet in discussions like this, you rarely if ever see people mentioning that context, which is a similar problem in discussions I've seen about the following topic. So, this discussion was basically inevitable, and I would like to begin it by admitting that I am way out of my depth on it. So I won't be drawing any firm conclusions. The suggestion that white actors playing POC characters in animation had a touch of minstrelsy about it was around prior to 2020, but it was a conversation that no one seemed to want to have where The Simpsons in particular was concerned. Because like with the strangulation discussion, it's basically been doing what it always did for decades while the world changed around it. And everyone has fond memories of the show and don't really want to acknowledge the potentially ugly side of something wholly positive to them. The retirement of Apu was a precursor to discussions over whether Harry Shearer should still be playing Dr. Hibbert and whether Hank Azaria should still be playing Carl. No new show would have made these castings if they were floated in 2010, let alone in 2020 when they were finally recast. The reason I wanted to cover this topic at all though is that there seems to be this general impression that the film The Problem with Apu, a documentary about the impact that Apu made on culture from the perspective of Asian Americans, was what caused the show to start re-evaluating its POC characters and for Apu in particular to vanish from the show. When that just doesn't line up with what I spent months watching at all. They actually started fading Apu out long before retiring him completely. I think it would be entirely fair of me to suggest that most people who entered the discourse over that film weren't actually still watching The Simpsons' current output. Sure, he is still there up until 2017, when that film made the unfolding conversations about Apu's effect on culture for Asian Americans impossible to ignore, but he goes from having usually at least one focal episode a season to being an occasional bit player as early as season 14. By season 20 it was a sudden surprise whenever Apu made a reappearance where I went, oh, he's still here. And this was 8 seasons before they retired him. He used to be quite a big deal. He's the only non-Simpson family member to get a level in The Simpsons Hit and Run. They even released a Lego Quickie Mart set. I actually bought it while it was still available. You see, that's where Homer fell asleep with his head in the door after he took on the second job so that he could afford to buy Lisa a pony. Look, this is the freezer where Jasper froze himself. And see, here's the squishy machine where Bart and Milhouse bought the super squishy when Bart joined the junior campers. You remember that episode? Okay, I do recognise that I have just gone off on a tangent, but in my defence, I'm trying to make this conversation at least a little bit fun and less of a minefield. This fairly early slow fade out of Apu was either a case of them getting bored of him or someone behind the scenes recognising the potential allegations of being a stereotype and trying to adapt the show to changing times. The last episode where Apu plays a prominent role happened 1 year prior to the problem with Apu. It was the season 27 episode Much Apu About Something, in which Apu's nephew inherits part ownership of the Quickie Mart from Sanjay. He remodels it and Apu is upset about that, and in response he accuses Apu of being a stereotype.
You're my uncle, bruh, and I love you, but you're a stereotype, man. Take a penny, leave a penny. I'm Indian. I do yoga.
Like with Love is a Many-Strangled Thing, the problem is that this episode feels defensive, because the show clearly doesn't want to change something that it's always done. And they obviously went into this episode with the preconceived idea that no, there's nothing wrong with Apu, and Apu will get the Quickie Mart back at the end, and everything will go back to normal. So it's not really a good faith defence of its position, because it's not a process of weighing up the arguments if it's decided it's not going to change before it starts, which it clearly has done. Approaching an argument in this way almost never results in what you want. I personally don't really know what to think. I love Much Apu About Nothing, the Golden Age episode that you've all seen a million times where Apu has to fight a new xenophobic law that's come in and he's looking at deportation. I do think the reaction to the problem with Apu was mostly a symptom of what I mentioned earlier about The Simpsons not really existing as a continuous show for most people, and now it exists as basically just endless reruns. So when you hear that someone's got a problem with Apu, your mind immediately goes to episodes like Homer and Apu and Much Apu About Nothing, and you get defensive, when those episodes are just not representative of the show as it was in 2017. I'm not making a call on Apu because I don't really have the perspective to offer much in the way of insight. I've heard conflicting opinions on him from people of Asian heritage, and I don't want to tell anyone what to think about him. All I know is that I'm completely at peace with the idea of there never being another Apu episode and the recasting of Hibbert and Carl. And while we're on the discussion of voice actors, there is one conversation that I don't want to have, but I kind of need to. This is the conversation that I've agonised over the most. I was close to cutting it because it's been that difficult, but I have come to the conclusion that I do need to cover it. There have been growing concerns online over the past few years regarding Marge's voice. Out-of-context clips keep being shared on YouTube and social media comparing what Marge sounded like in the 90s to what she sounds like now.
Why don't you bring this potato? It's pretty big.
Mom, you're always trying to give me potatoes. What is it with you?
I just think they're neat.
You must have known I wasn't happy in Springfield. All I did was play the blues.
Are you sure you didn't play the blues because slow tempos are easier?
Maybe a little.
Now, yes, the cast are all getting older, and people's voices do change as they get older. And I've shown disinterested parties clips of modern Marge, and they have remarked how, wait, did they replace her? Why does she sound so different? Because yes, I do agree it is obvious. But when I've seen this discussion go further to the point of people calling for Julie Kavanaugh to either retire or for Marge to be retired entirely or a replacement cast, I'm not saying this is conscious. I do think it comes with a touch of people undervaluing the acting talent required of voice acting. Voice acting isn't just reading words on a page, it's selling the idea of this animated character as if they were a real person. And Marge Simpson is arguably the most important character in The Simpsons. This isn't like a Carl or a Dr. Hibbert. She needs to be funny, and she needs to carry at least half of the show's sense of sincerity. Unlike lots of roles on The Simpsons, this is a role that requires serious acting chops. And the thing I want to point out is that sure, when Marge is basically just a prop in a story about someone else, I noticed her aged voice immediately. But when the story is primarily about Marge and I get invested in that story, Julie Kavanaugh still sells the hell out of it, and when that happens, most of the time I either don't notice, or if I do, it doesn't bother me. If I shared you an out-of-context clip of this season 28 episode, The Last Traction Hero, in which Marge becomes friends with and starts bonding with Smithers, you would probably notice her aged voice immediately, but in the moment, as I was watching the episode, I didn't notice it, because it didn't matter. The story was compelling to me. I wasn't hearing Julie Kavner as Marge Simpson, I was hearing Marge Simpson. I wasn't thinking about the actress in the recording booth, I believed the character. Alright, sometimes she sounds more like Patty and Selma than she does Marge, but in the right context it doesn't really matter to me. In this season 30 episode, Doe Canada, where Lisa accidentally ends up in Canada and gets fostered by a Canadian family, and she likes it and she wants to stay, when Marge insists she comes home, yes, she doesn't sound quite the same, but she does sound like a mother who's putting her foot down.
I'm your mother, and you live where I live. You're coming home with me.
There was a genuinely great one in season 35 called A Mid-Childhood Night's Dream, in which Marge has nightmares while she's sick, where Bart grows up and she feels like she's losing her special little guy.
My time as a mom will eventually come to an end. I'll have to fill my days with a bunch of stupid hobbies.
I love dream-based episodes, and Julie Kavner captures the essence of fear and anxiety that a mother feels watching her kid's childhood slip through her fingers so beautifully in this episode. While yeah, she doesn't sound quite the same, when you're in the moment, invested in the story, this one demonstrates how Julie Kavner is probably the strongest actress that The Simpsons has ever had. Then there is a context in which you can actually kinda believe her voice now, because Marge has been putting up with a lot of shit from Homer for years, so she's obviously exhausted by him, isn't she? People have started saying similar things about Mr. Burns' voice recently, and while yes, he doesn't sound the same, the thing I want to point out is that Mr. Burns is supposed to be somewhere between 80 and 104 years old, and Harry Shearer is now in his 80s. So yes, he does sound slightly different, but he does sound like an 80-year-old man. Because he is. The sound might not be what you're used to, but in context of the story, I don't really see this being a massive problem.
Oppenheimer, I am so sick of hearing about that jerk. Well, I built a bomb, then I was sad when they dropped it.
I mean, people say it's a problem because it's not the sound of The Simpsons as we know it, and that's a problem out here in the real world for fans watching it, but in the fictional world of the story, what's actually wrong here? I mean, people complain that the new Carl and Dr. Hibbert don't sound quite right, and they would definitely make the same complaint if potential new Marge and Mr. Burns castings didn't sound right, so the way I see it, they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. As said, there are actually creative solutions that could be employed here to make the inevitable change to people's voices that come with age work in context. There was this episode in season 27 where Marge gets a job cleaning up crime scenes, and as a result becomes incredibly depressed, and that fits with her lower voice a lot better.
I'm not in the mood.
What? You've never said that before!
I've thought it 3 times. Each time was after a burrito eating contest.
Marge actually feels incredibly at home in the Flash Forward episodes now. Sure, she doesn't sound 39-40 anymore, but she does sound like she's in her 70s. Because Julie Kavner is. Maybe they could age the family up on a consistent basis? I don't know, just a thought. Like with most of the things I've talked about so far, context is everything, and you're just not going to get that context if you're making this complaint based off of seeing a few clips posted to social media. And when I've seen people online make this point about Marge's voice, I've considered it, and I've tried to imagine watching a Simpsons episode with anyone else playing Marge Simpson, and I've just gotten stuck there. I can't do it. I just don't want to watch a Simpsons episode with anyone other than Julie Kavner playing Marge Simpson. This character is too important to me. I personally think the show needs to end if any one of Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Yardley Smith, or Nancy Cartwright ever leave. The show couldn't continue without any of those 4 components. Granted, yes, the show probably should have ended by now because it does feel kind of pointless there being so much of the same content, and given the sheer amount of Simpsons I had to watch for this, it really crystallised the need for me to try and answer the following question. So, what is the point of The Simpsons now? Okay, the opening of this section is going to sound like an unrelated tangent, but it's actually highly relevant, so please bear with me. Recently the BBC announced the cancellation of their mid-profile daytime soap opera, Doctors, which is a show, as the title implies, is about some doctors. And a lot of people were upset about this. But the reason these people were upset was not because they were fans of it. The people that got upset were mostly industry people pointing out that Doctors was a low-stakes training ground for TV writers and crew. No actual viewer of the show expected Doctors to blow them away. So it's the perfect place for newcomers to the TV industry to be tested in the question of, can you either write or crew for a 30-minute TV drama made to a brief and broadcast to a small audience that will probably forgive or forget any mistakes that get made? Because they're making hundreds of episodes of it, and if one of them sucks, it doesn't matter. Another will be along any minute. Training people up is part of the reason that soap operas exist in the first place. The TV industry needs low-stakes shows because otherwise, where is its talent going to learn its trade? In terms of American comedy, most people get their start writing one-liners for the talk shows, but with The Simpsons, what we've got here is an animated TV sitcom that produces more content than most people can keep up with, that's big enough and influential enough to have been around forever and not be under threat of cancellation anytime soon. So it's the perfect testing ground for newer writers to try their stuff in the field of the incredibly profitable genre of animated sitcom. It's low stakes, but high profile. If you're in that writer's room and your name gets put on a shitty Simpsons episode, shitty or not, it's still on a Simpsons episode. And barely anyone cares enough to complain about the show anymore, even if they are still watching it, so it's the perfect testing ground for emerging talent. Granted, this essentially means the show as it exists now is basically Simpsons Golden Age fanfiction, which becomes even more apparent as you start noticing more and more tiny references to classic episodes in later seasons. But my point is that if you look at this list of over 150 people who've had their name on a Simpsons episode, presumably many more who've been in those writers' rooms who got a joke in maybe, even if they never had their name under the writing credit, and like with the cultural influence, I see a noble purpose there. And not just writers, voice actors, directors, recordists, animators. The Simpsons is in a unique position where it can be their playground now. Sure, we can all hold grudges against specific episodes all we want. I know some people probably are going to say, for example, if an episode's shit, that proves the people working on it were talentless and don't deserve their success. No, it doesn't. Hundreds of people work on these things, and have you never had a bad day at work before? And that's also the point of tests. Sometimes tests fail, sometimes these people can try something and an episode might not work. The current golden boy of Simpsons discourse is Matt Selman. He was a co-writer on The Simpsons movie, collectively understood to be good. He's listed as the writer on generally adored episodes like Trilogy of Error. His name is also on That 90s Show. If episodes fail, the audience on the other end of the equation usually forget about it, and at the end of it, the people that worked on it still get to have a Simpsons episode on their creative CV, and they definitely learned something from the experience. I may not have liked the Musk who fell to earth, but the guy credited under writer for it, Neil Campbell, he definitely learned something from the experience of writing on The Simpsons, and he took what he learned and built on it in the years afterwards. That's what's important. And having low stakes, that does grant The Simpsons a certain degree of creative freedom to experiment with the format, which connects up nicely with my next segment. Yeah, as stale as the show might feel if you're watching a random run of about 6 episodes of it, occasionally you'll run into something that might not always be good as such, but is genuinely an interesting spin on The Simpsons, where longtime fans like me could find something to either enjoy or at the very least mine for a random talking point. There was this episode in season 26 called Peeping Mom, which was interesting to me because I'm really fond of the season 7 episode Marge Be Not Proud, which seems to be divisive for people because it's so bleak and uncompromising. I like Marge Be Not Proud a lot because it feels like a legitimate depiction of a mother and son's relationship breaking down. I understand why some people might find it off-putting, but my point is that Peeping Mom is basically Marge Be Not Proud if it had the tone of a normal Simpsons episode. And unsurprisingly to me, it doesn't work nearly as well. Basically, Bart spends the episode telling Marge that he had nothing to do with an incident involving a bulldozer, and so she spends all episode following him everywhere because she doesn't trust him anymore. It is funny, but I wasn't feeling the intensity of a son who's lost his mother's trust because it's played with much broader comedic strokes than Marge Be Not Proud. But as much as I didn't like Peeping Mom, I appreciated it because it proved my point about why Marge Be Not Proud works, and why it's necessary to frame the Marge-Bart dynamic in realistic terms so you actually care about their relationship. Of course, you aren't going to get that out of this episode unless you are very specifically me. It's a boutique episode, not personally tailored to me so I can prove a stupid point obviously, but the result of the random number generator of The Simpsons throwing out something of which I can get something of value. A bit like how the reason The Simpsons seems to keep predicting the future is definitely less real supernatural powers and more the random number generator throwing up scenarios that align. At least I hope that's what it is in this case.
Listen, Marge, you've had me throw a lot of things away that I really love. We might want to save my 2014 joke-a-day calendar, because the calendar's the same in the year 2031, and we're really going to need some laughs then, after World War China.
So yeah, look forward to that. Although Marge being not proud was probably something that occurred to the writers while they were working on Peeping Mom, because as said, modern Simpsons is very, very aware of its history. And given I've been watching the entire thing through from start to finish, it was interesting just how obscure some of the referencing got. They even call back to the controversy over the Brazil episode from season 13 by sending the family there again.
To try to avoid any misunderstandings in Brazil like we had the last time, I'm learning the language.
Eu amo o Brasil.
Eu amo Brazil.
Will you please turn that off? It's annoying the hell out of the flight crew.
I was just trying to learn the...
Everyone thinks they can learn our language on the plane. Do you know how disrespectful that is?
I mentioned earlier that some episodes basically play like remakes of older episodes, and it can end up feeling kind of pointless in cases like the 7-Beer Itch versus The Last Temptation of Homer, but very rarely this works and feels necessary. Pixelated and Afraid from season 33 is basically a modern update of the season 1 episode, The Call of the Simpsons. That episode is interesting because while season 1 is quite gritty and realistic when it comes to Homer's existential crisis, Marge's almost infidelity, Lisa's depression, but The Call of the Simpsons, where Homer gets mistaken for Bigfoot and Maggie becomes the leader of some bears, it very much goes against the Simpsons' original mission statement of a real family that just happens to be a cartoon. Conversely, Pixelated and Afraid feels very real. Marge and Homer are in a rut, and the kids are concerned about that, so they push them into going to a romantic resort, where the car gets wrecked and they have to survive together in the wilderness. You feel like you're watching a real married couple trying to figure out how to effectively work together. While yes, all of this is basically just me going, I clapped when I saw it. Sometimes they hit on something really interesting by recontextualizing bits of the Golden Age, by, for example, expanding on minor characters. I really enjoyed season 26's flashback episode, The Kids Are All Fight, where we flash back to around the time of Lisa's first word, where Grandma Flanders, remember her?
Hello, Joe!
Well, she comes back, and she dies while babysitting Bart, Lisa, Rod and Todd. Well, she doesn't die, they undo it at the end. But my point is that it was an interesting reuse of a character that we hadn't seen in 2 decades by having these further glimpses at parts of the family's past that they used to use a lot more sparingly. The flashbacks started to become a regular highlight for me. I also started really looking forward to the flash forward episodes, not just Holidays of Future Past. There's a really cool one from season 27 called Barthood, a parody of the Richard Linklater film Boyhood, which shows Bart's life as a teenager. It's really cool seeing him just slightly further along in the timeline to usual. You forget how quickly you change as a person in just a couple of years as a kid, and actually seeing it happen when you've spent this long with Bart and Lisa at the same ages is such a sudden jolt to your understanding of The Simpsons.
Thanks, but you know I'm not into Krusty anymore.
You've outgrown Krusty? First no more I Caramba, now this.
Barthood's not just interesting for fans though, it can actually be quite powerful. It shows how Bart had a much richer relationship with Grandpa over the years. There's a really quite touching scene of Bart talking to his grave after he's died in the intervening years that hit an emotional spot for me that the flash forward episodes typically hit with a lot more power than regular episodes. It's also interesting how you can construct a timeline threading Barthood through future drama, Lisa's wedding, Holidays of Future Past, and you can actually watch The Simpsons grow up and start families of their own. Add the flashback episodes before it, and you've basically got a string of episodes that run through the entire timeline, as if there's this version of the show hiding inside the main show, where The Simpsons doesn't exist in a state of temporal paralysis anymore. You get to watch the kids born, then they grow up, and then they mature. In fact, I was thinking throughout Barthood that this is probably what a Simpsons movie 2 should look like. The Simpsons movie is a big popcorn disaster epic made at a time when The Simpsons was still relatively young and still popular among mainstream audiences. As mentioned in my last one of these, it's the model of what an average Simpsons episode looks like blown up to giant size. Now it's years later, and it's mostly just diehards and people wistful for their childhood still paying attention. And the show is older and much more aware of its place in pop culture now, so I think a full coming-of-age story for Bart and Lisa would probably be how you would sell a Simpsons movie in the modern era. There's also a lot of untapped potential in The Simpsons to see regular characters at different points in the timeline, and whenever these different glimpses showed up, I suddenly pricked up my ears and went, huh, that's actually noteworthy. My notes on every episode started bleeding out into just a few lines by around season 23, but I always wrote it down whenever we see brief flashbacks. There was this episode in season 26 that opens on a brief flashback where it reveals that Hans Moleman was mayor of Springfield before Mayor Quimby. It's pure setup for what turns into a subpar episode, but I found myself willing it to just stay here in the past for a bit longer. In the video I did on the middle period, a large bulk of the segment I did on underrated episodes from that time was episodes about minor characters who'd never been explored in much depth before, like Comic Book Guy. And this is genuinely how you could continue weaving rich narratives into The Simpsons, because there are hundreds of characters who haven't had nearly as much attention paid to them over the years as the family has had. Mr. Largo has been a regular minor character since season 1. An episode in season 30 starts and it seems like he's going to be the main character for the first 5 minutes, and I went, that's new. But then it derails into just another episode about Lisa. I just started feeling after I'd sat through entire seasons with almost nothing noteworthy in them at all that at about season 23 or 24 they probably should have tried something daring on a more regular basis, like start the family aging at a normal rate, even if it's just an experiment for like a season or two. Because the stories from other points in the timeline always had much more urgency about them, and I actually felt something for the characters and their struggles for happiness in the same way I would of a normal sitcom. And really, that's what Matt Groening always wanted, wasn't it? And you can see them grasping at this point. It's blatantly obvious in episodes like Brick Like Me from season 25, the famous Lego brick episode, of which the entire point is that a life spent trapped in stasis where no one has to change and Lisa doesn't have to grow up and move on from Lego is not a life worth lived.
Go to the movie with your friends. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that I can't stop you from growing up.
I love you, Dad.
Which is true, it's touching and charming, but I couldn't help watching this after 500 episodes of the show at that point, repeating basically the same formulas over and over again and going, you, of all shows, having that as the moral of the story. Really, Simpsons, really? Why did I buy the Lego Simpsons house if the point of the Lego episode is that I shouldn't?
Hey homie, what are you thinking about today?
I'm thinking about how everything I say and do is meaningless and we're all just reenacting the same 3 or 4 plot lines over and over again and how the Fox network just won't let me die. The alternatively formatted episodes are usually the most noteworthy ones in the season. There's the odd one or two that are just standard Simpsons episodes where my wandering attention got caught off guard and suddenly it felt like I was watching season 8 or 9 again, like a totally fun thing that Bart will never do again. But usually it is the flash forward episodes, the flashbacks, or ones with interesting storytelling gimmicks. There was this fun one in season 29 where it randomly becomes a throwback 70s detective show. The gimmick ones aren't always good, of course, like this famous one called Moe Goes From Rags to Riches, where Jeremy Irons guest stars as Moe's wash rag, and he describes his journey through history to become Moe's wash rag.
Yes, that's right. Everyone laugh at the rag. But I was not always this stained swatch you see before you.
It's completely inexplicable, but I'll give it this, it's noteworthy. I suddenly looked up and scratched my head and was wondering if I was dreaming this. Of course, there are gimmicks that are gimmicks and nothing more than that, and they seem to have started using them purely to generate headlines during the current period, which clearly works and does get people interested again. They did this with me the other year, where a season 34 episode, Lisa the Boy Scout, directly addressed internet fan theories in a sketch show format about aborted Simpsons episodes you were never meant to see. They even recently did a sequel to my favourite episode from season 1, Life on the Fast Lane. Yeah, they brought back Jock, the bowling instructor that Marge very nearly cheated on Homer with, and it's really, really bad. It's got the exact same problem as that 90s show. Marge makes it perfectly clear that she's not interested in Jock anymore, so where's the threat? That was why Life on the Fast Lane was so compelling. It felt real and dangerous and harrowing. This feels like it was written specifically so a clickbait article writer can use the headline, "The Simpsons just brought back a character that hasn't been seen in 34 years. I'm pretty sure that looking for news coverage was the entire reason they started doing 2-part episodes again. The Great Fatsby in season 28 did not need to be 45 minutes long, because I'm pretty sure they could have done The Great Gatsby but with Mr. Burns in 22 minutes as usual, but it being 2 parts makes it noteworthy. Marge's subplot is alright, but the whole thing feels like it lasts forever, and unlike Who Shot Mr. Burns, it's not spread across a season finale and there's no hook to keep me on the edge of my seat. Same thing with the next 2-part episode, Warren Priests in season 31. Where a cool new pastor comes to Springfield and takes Reverend Lovejoy's job. It feels a bit aimless and wishy-washy, and is filled with seemingly never-ending scenes about just how wonderful this new pastor is that don't serve the plot about there being a mysterious secret hidden in his past at all. When these things really need a meaty hook to grab people's interest. They seem to have figured this out with the latest two-part episode in season 33, A Serious Flanders, a parody of prestige TV shows, specifically Fargo. It's got an intricate plot about Flanders getting targeted by a debt collector who killed his grandfather. Who Shot Mr. Burns demonstrated what this episode gets perfectly. If a two-part episode is gonna work, it needs to go all in on plot. So, as you can see, good and bad, there are episodes that do stick out if you actually pay attention to the show. I understand why people don't, but it's not as if the entirety of modern Simpsons is a complete waste of time. And I am totally not saying that as a way of justifying sinking thousands and thousands of hours into this project to myself. Anyway, there is now only one more question left to answer. People have been saying it would be impossible to give The Simpsons a satisfying ending since even before the movie. It's never been a show that's been working towards a conclusion. The purpose of The Simpsons is to act out infinite scenarios centered around a dumb father, introverted housewife, intellectual daughter, rebellious son, and a baby. And when you say infinite, it ends up feeling like, as South Park theorized about Family Guy, that a Simpsons plot is generated by Manatee stringing random words together. Do you want to see an episode where it's World War II and Marge goes to assassinate Hitler while he sat in a movie theatre watching a Nazi remake of Dumbo? If so, wow, those are some very, very specific story requirements. But they did do it. Even some of the more basic concepts start feeling like clutching at straws. We want to do a sports episode. Which ones have we done already? We did football, baseball, hockey. Have we done lacrosse? Okay, screw it, let's do lacrosse. They've also done a fair few episodes that either seem like appropriate conclusions or underline a point about The Simpsons about how it should have ended by now, as I mentioned earlier with Brick Like Me's conclusion. And thinking about it, that probably would have been a good final episode. Apparently Holidays of Future Past was initially written to potentially be a final Simpsons episode if the circumstances aligned that way, and most people agree that that one would have worked pretty well. There's a really cool sequence at the end of season 29's finale, Flanders Ladder, where it flashes forward and does a montage of how all the characters die. They did another gimmick episode recently where they opened the season with an episode proclaiming itself to be the final Simpsons episode, in which everyone in Springfield starts moving on with their lives. But Bart fights the world that's winding its way towards a conclusion because he's just not ready to turn 11 yet. He's not ready for the show to end. This one's basically an existential horror. It's kind of like a Simpsons creepypasta, because it works to highlight how just the idea of there being a final Simpsons episode at all feels so unnatural.
Just blow out the candles and have a happy birthday.
Then everyone can be happy.
No! Happy people don't exist in Springfield!
I understand why people find the idea of The Simpsons ending either impossible or nonsensical. It's been running forever and has exhausted basically every possible storyline. However, I would disagree with the idea it's impossible to end it in a satisfying way, because for one thing, eventually, it's going to have to end. It is a miracle that the main cast have been happy to stay for as long as they have, but they can't keep this up indefinitely, and given the major backlash towards the use of AI in entertainment, the idea that I am pretty certain you have all thought about at least once that it is possible to carry on the show indefinitely using AI-generated voices for the characters would inevitably be met with fierce resistance. Some of it from me, who, as said, I just don't want to watch a Simpsons episode with anyone other than Julie Kavanaugh playing Marge Simpson. So if we accept the fact it has to end eventually, what I'd like to point out is that these potential endings that have cropped up over the years act as potential counters to the suggestion that it's impossible for The Simpsons to end in a satisfying way. Because they have proven the show is still capable of doing something that's a potential conclusion, even if it's not ready to end yet. It would be hard, sure, but the fact these potential endings have flashed up over the years kinda proves that there's probably not much to worry about in terms of quality when it comes to the actual prospective final Simpsons episode. It could just up and leave us on a random episode that hits you with a bit more emotional power that's been used sparingly in recent seasons. It could be, say, a simple flash forward to the future where Lisa, Bart and Maggie are all elderly. They're in different care homes, and their kids come and visit them and take them on a trip back to Springfield. Their kids take them to a fireworks display in the town square by the Jebediah Springfield statue. And Lisa, Bart and Maggie meet again, and they watch the fireworks. And they have a simple little conversation about how their childhoods were pretty crazy, weren't they? And then it plays Landslide or something. Not saying it should literally be that, but something like that would make everyone feel wistful and nostalgic and would probably do it for me. The Simpsons' strongest moments are little displays of emotion. After everything I watched, the strongest scene for me remains Homer's proposal in I Married Marge. It's small, it's humble, and that's what gives it its power. If the show ends on a scene like this and really taps into people's memories of a time when The Simpsons felt like the most meaningful show on TV, that power would probably be enough to counter all the crap that I've spent this and the previous video complaining about. As with Regarding Margie, as with Halloween of Horror, these little singular moments where the show makes me feel something again are still possible, and when they work, all the other problems just melt away. When I decided to watch the entirety of The Simpsons to date for this project, it was partly backed by my interest in examining the question of when did The Simpsons actually go bad, because I found it fascinating that while there is general agreement that it did go bad, the fact people have lots of different answers to the question of when indicates this perception isn't quite as solid as it's been made to seem while people have been repeating the assertion The Simpsons isn't good anymore for the last 2.5 decades. And I also wanted to understand what made it go bad and why. And now that I've watched all of it to date, and I will be keeping up with it until it ends because otherwise this entire project will feel like a massive waste of time, now that I've watched everything so far, in spite of the complaints that I've had, and I started to get my suspicions that this was probably the conclusion I was going to reach by about season 20, but now I'm at the end, it feels right to say it. The Simpsons didn't go bad. It was always fine. The rest of it's not amazing like those first seasons were, but it never went significantly bad. Some episodes sure, but not on a consistent basis. Because if it went bad in season 12, explain the one where Homer gets the crayon stuck in his brain removed. If it went bad after the movie, explain Eternal Moonshine, Holidays of Future Past, or Barthood. Post-Golden Age, The Simpsons was always a perfectly adequate adult animated comedy, with good days and bad days. If I hadn't watched the entire thing, I would be stuck at the questions of when it goes bad and whether it's gotten good again, and those conversations are usually had by people who dipped in and out of it. Sure, sometimes it's from people who've watched it consistently as seasons 16, 17, 18, 19 and 20 were broadcast, so yeah, if you've seen all of it like I have, then this opinion seems more solid, but you've got to remember that when you watch it year in, year out, you've got to take into consideration how you have changed as a person. You aged 16 and you aged 32 are two very different people. Your tastes may have changed, or your experience of life outside of a television show may have affected the way that you engage with fiction. Say you had a really bad day in the year 2000 and sat down to watch The Simpsons at the end of it. Something that you were spending all day looking forward to, and that episode happened to be Homer Simpson in kidney trouble. The next few episodes weren't that great either. That's going to leave a bad impression, and whether the show does something great like Homer over the next couple of years, it isn't going to remove that sense of profound disappointment that you had when you needed The Simpsons to be good and it just wasn't. Life just does affect the way we view media, and everyone's experience of culture just is different. I had a shit couple of weeks while I was watching season 14 and the first half of season 15 while I was doing this watch through, and I was thinking, maybe this is where it actually starts sucking. But then I was really impressed with the second half of season 15. When you watch the entire thing from A to B, you see that mechanically it pretty much, not strictly speaking, is the same as it always was, because it did evolve with the changing environment of adult animated comedy, and it adapted itself to the world that changed around it, but it's usually at the very least functional. But I do see why people don't watch it this way, because as said, it takes forever. And functional or not, it does numb you to it, and it does feel artistically pointless to produce so much of the same content. So many episodes are just exactly the same and they don't make an impact on you at all. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not competent. The biggest criticism that you can fling at The Simpsons is that there just is too much of it. I spent about 18 months spending a large amount of my spare time watching it, and I get why it's easier to form a skimmed opinion of The Simpsons than one backed by the whole of it, but I have one backed by the whole of it to date now, and this is the conclusion that I've reached. It's fine. A modern Simpsons episode is usually good enough. And if you want to go ahead and watch the whole thing yourself if you feel like you want to try and disprove me, go ahead, do it, I dare you. Anyway, before I finish up, let's do a quick top 10 of the best episodes of The Simpsons post-movie. Number 10, The Great Simpsina. This one is here for one reason and one reason only. It directly followed Love is a Many-Strangled Thing. It wouldn't be anywhere near a best list under any other circumstances, but it was the palate cleanser that I needed at the time to convince me that beyond this point didn't lie hell itself. Basically, Lisa befriends an elderly magician and he starts teaching her his tricks. It's not amazing or anything to write home about, but it's funny, cute, and it had a few moments where I saw the beating heart of the show underneath the trappings of modern Simpsons.
If magic is not passed on, it dies. The only magic we couldn't make was a child.
Number 9, Barthood. Given we're so used to The Simpsons as essentially stock characters with basic definitions by this point, I think it is pretty much inevitable that it takes either a flashback or a flash forward to make you really appreciate again just how interesting they are as people. If you've never seen this one before, you will definitely get a lot out of it. Number 8, Treehouse of Horror 33. I was still hopeful for Treehouse episodes whenever I ran into them, because the wild and crazy nature of the early ones still appears occasionally. There's a really cool segment in Treehouse 20 where it's styled like an Alfred Hitchcock movie, where Bart and Lisa have a strangers on a train arrangement. The animation is gorgeous and it felt like I was watching one of the early ones. But then the rest of Treehouse 20 was pretty subpar, as were the next 9 or 10 editions, save the odd segment or two. It took all the way up until Treehouse 33 where I was suddenly surprised by just how strong all of the segments were. There's a parody of The Babadook, one of the best horror films of the 2010s, starring Marge and Maggie. There's a gorgeously animated take on Death Note, and one of the finest Treehouse segments ever, a Simpsons take on Westworld, where the family are robots in a Simpsons theme park in the future. There's a lot of backlash over meta-comedy at the moment, which I feel is a shame because it's a type of comedy that I generally love. But if you think it's always a bad thing, I highly recommend trying this segment because it uses The Simpsons' reputation to analyse how the family members would react to their lives being commercialised to the extent that they have been. It's a cross between comedy and existential horror.
Get your fat bum in that hedge! Name!
Number 7, a totally fun thing that Bart will never do again. I've mentioned this one a couple of times throughout. The family go on a cruise and Bart doesn't want it to end, so he uses a clip from a film to make it look like there's a global pandemic on land, so they have to remain at sea indefinitely. This episode's also notable because this scenario would sort of actually happen about 8 years later when COVID hit. Yeah, this is another of those Simpsons predicted it moments. As well as being an example of the show doing a funny and meaningful family comedy in much more extreme circumstances than you might expect of a family comedy, like it always used to back in the era that everybody loves, it's just a haunting watch now.
Outbreak of the deadly Pandora virus is spreading rapidly. Unprecedented threat requires a worldwide quarantine. All ships must remain at sea.
Number 6, steal this episode. Homer starts showing pirated movies in his backyard and ends up a target of the FBI. This one is essentially the antithesis of the Season 2 classic Homer vs. Lisa and the Eighth Commandment, which is very much a product of its time and it plays very differently in the modern day. The idea of presenting one person stealing cable from a massive multi-billion-dollar corporation that isn't even going to notice it isn't really something you'd think of as the ideal case of a character wrestling with their soul anymore. And it's actually quite refreshing to see one of Fox's biggest shows acknowledge that the over-the-top seriousness with which piracy is treated by the entertainment industry does make them look frankly ridiculous considering the state of the economy. Granted, this episode isn't exactly a nuanced argument, but damn is it cathartic. Just a spoiler, all of the following entries I've mentioned at various points in the video. Number 5, Halloween of Horror. God, go watch this one, and importantly, watch it in isolation. Remove the context, remove all your memories of Homer vs. Dignity, the Elon Musk one, the Gaga one. You're just watching a child deal with trauma and the parents reacting to it. Number 4, Brick Like Me. Despite the message feeling staggeringly out of place in this show, you can't help but admire the sheer amount of effort on screen in this one. And the story being rooted in Homer's disappointment that Lisa's growing up and moving on from Lego, something they'd bonded over, gave the episode the sincerity and warmth of Golden Age Simpsons. Episodes like this were truly what kept the show going during that numb period that set in over the course of its second decade. Number 3, Dial N for Nerder. While people started complaining about how wrong it felt for the show to showcase much more extreme behaviour than usual, this one felt wild and different in a way that still honoured who Bart and Lisa are as people. I genuinely love this one. Number 2, Holidays of Future Past. It's funny and charming like the best of the Golden Age, and if, as Al Jean's been quoted as saying, it was prepared in case the cast negotiations fell through and forced the show to end and it had to serve as a final episode, I don't think anyone would have minded all that much if it went out on something as funny and emotionally sound as this. And it is unlikely that it's the only episode that's been prepared for such a scenario. And number 1. Yes, of course, it's Eternal Moonshine of the Simpson Mind. I know that calling it the best episode of Modern Simpsons is probably pushing it a bit since it is over 15 years old now, but I think it's the best demonstration of what the show could possibly do to justify its continued existence post-movie, and post the realisation that nothing Homer could do would ever break the family up. It is genuinely great, and is the best answer to the assertion that The Simpsons isn't worth watching after season 9, 10, 11, or whenever the Golden Age is supposed to stop. So yeah, thanks for watching everybody, special thanks to all my patrons, and extra special thanks to the following generous people. A. Maxwell, Aidan Jenks, Alistair McPherson, Anirin Hunt, Brandon Kelly, Captain Greza, Charlotte Discordia, Chris Lim, Chris P, Dave Sanders, James Morgan Belcher, Jennifer Milligan, Joel, Laurie, Matthew Brench, Max Kennedy, Oxbow Izamsti, Robert Conley, Sabrina Wade, The Hickster, and Tony Thompson. Cheers everybody, thanks for watching.